In 125, on a day whose exact date has long been forgotten, a Roman army under the command of the praetor Lucius Opimius advanced south through Latium. Their destination was Fregellae, a flourishing town nearly 100 kilometers from Rome. The journey took several days, but the outcome would reshape the history of Italy. For 2 centuries, Fregellae had stood as one of Rome's most dependable Latin allies. Founded as a Roman colony, it had supplied soldiers for campaigns against Carthage and fought alongside Rome in the eastern Mediterranean. Its strategic position along the Via Latina, one of the most important roads connecting central and southern Italy, transformed it into a prosperous commercial and military center. By the 2nd century BCE, Fregellae had become an impressive city. Wide streets were carefully laid out in a planned grid, surrounding a lively forum filled with public buildings and elegant porticos. Sophisticated bath complexes reflected the wealth of its citizens, while an aqueduct delivered fresh running water throughout the settlement. Overlooking the town stood a magnificent sanctuary dedicated to Aesculapius, the god of healing, welcoming visitors from across the region. Fregellae embodied the prosperity and urban sophistication that characterized many successful communities of Roman Italy. Yet, beneath this prosperity, tensions with Rome had been steadily increasing. When the people of Fregellae finally rose in rebellion, the Roman Senate responded with overwhelming force. Lucius Opimius was dispatched to crush the revolt without hesitation. The city's impressive walls, its wealth, and even the protection sought from its gods proved powerless against Rome's determination. Before the year had ended, Fregellae had been stormed, destroyed, and erased from the political map of Italy. Today, this dramatic event is often treated as little more than a footnote in Roman history. Historians have traditionally focused on the social war that erupted decades later, or on Opimius's infamous role in suppressing Gaius Gracchus in 121 BCE. Compared with those famous events, the destruction of Fregellae has frequently appeared to be of secondary importance. But that perspective is shaped by hindsight. To those living in the late 2nd century BCE, the fall of Fregellae was anything but insignificant. It represented a dangerous turning point that revealed how dramatically Rome's relationship with its Italian allies was changing. The destruction of a loyal Latin colony demonstrated that military service and long-standing loyalty no longer guaranteed security when political disagreements emerged. Many Roman writers of later generations viewed the city's destruction as an early warning of the violence that would soon consume the Republic. While modern accounts often identify 133 BCE, the year Tiberius Gracchus was killed, as the beginning of Rome's age of internal conflict, the fate of Fregellae exposed another side of the same. Crisis. It highlighted growing divisions not only within Rome itself, but also between Rome and the communities that had helped build its power. The story of Fregellae therefore cannot be understood in isolation. Its destruction was the culmination of political developments that had been unfolding for generations. It reflected a more uncompromising Roman attitude toward its Italian allies and revealed deep structural problems within the expanding republic. Looking beyond the politics of the capital allows us to see that this was not merely a crisis affecting the city of Rome. It was a crisis spreading across the entire Italian peninsula and, ultimately, throughout the Mediterranean world. To understand why Fregellae met such a tragic end, we must first step back and examine how Rome transformed from a regional Italian power into the dominant force of the Mediterranean. That transformation accelerated after the First Punic War. Ancient historians, especially Polybius, regarded Rome's expansion as one of the most extraordinary developments of their age. Within only a few generations, Rome defeated Carthage, conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula, and dismantled several powerful Hellenistic kingdoms in the east. By the close of the 3rd century BCE, Roman influence stretched across nearly the entire Mediterranean. Among Rome's earliest and most significant overseas acquisitions was Sicily. Following victory in the First Punic War in 241 BCE, most of the island came directly under Roman authority, while the Greek kingdom of Syracuse remained an allied state under King Hieron II. Just a few years later, Rome also seized Corsica and Sardinia, territories that had previously belonged to Carthage. In 227 BCE, these islands were formally organized into a single Roman province. Holding these new territories proved far more difficult than conquering them. Local resistance continued for decades, forcing Rome into repeated military campaigns to maintain control. Even so, these overseas possessions marked a revolutionary shift in Roman policy. For the first time, Rome governed substantial territories beyond Italy through officials sent directly from the Republic. Originally, the Latin word provincia described the responsibilities assigned to a magistrate rather than a specific geographical region. Over time, however, the term evolved into something much closer to what we now understand as a province, a defined territory administered on Rome's behalf. Because the administrative system was still developing, provincial governors enjoyed broad authority. They exercised considerable freedom in military operations, taxation, and local administration, often shaping Roman rule according to their own judgment. These early experiments in governing overseas lands laid the foundations for an empire. That would soon dominate much of the known world, but they also created new political pressures that would eventually reach back into Italy itself. Archaeology paints a fascinating picture of Rome's earliest overseas provinces. Rather than erasing local cultures overnight, Roman rule often reshaped economies long before it transformed identities. Sardinia is one of the clearest examples. Excavations reveal that local communities continued living much as they had for generations. Traditional villages remained occupied, ancient burial customs survived, and Roman-style cities appeared only slowly. Yet beneath this cultural continuity, dramatic economic changes were unfolding. Agriculture expanded on a much larger scale, land was cultivated more intensively, and Roman-made pottery became increasingly common across the island. Instead of forcing the Sardinians to abandon their traditions, Rome gradually drew them into a growing Mediterranean economy. The island became an important supplier of wealth and agricultural products, serving the interests of its new rulers while preserving much of its local character. A similar story unfolded in Sicily. Long before Rome arrived, Sicily had already been one of the Mediterranean's most diverse regions. Greek colonies flourished along the coast, indigenous communities dominated much of the interior, and western Sicily had spent generations under Carthaginian influence. Each culture left its mark, creating a remarkably varied landscape that survived well into the Roman period. Roman conquest did not immediately erase this diversity. Instead, it redirected Sicily toward Rome's military and economic needs. One of the clearest signs of this shift appears in trade. Archaeologists have discovered growing numbers of wine amphorae imported from Italy, especially from Campania. This increase reflected a new economic relationship. Sicily paid much of its tribute in grain, which was shipped north to feed the growing population of Rome. Merchant vessels rarely returned empty. They carried Italian wine back to Sicilian ports, creating profitable trade networks that benefited Roman merchants, Italian producers, and many Sicilian communities alike. Even as commerce became increasingly tied to Rome, Sicily retained a surprising degree of independence. Most Sicilian cities continued producing their own bronze and copper coinage, although silver currency increasingly followed Roman standards. Local governments still financed public projects, maintained their own defensive forces, and organized protection against piracy. Rather than replacing every institution, Rome often allowed existing systems to continue, provided they supported Roman interests. This was not a fully centralized empire in the modern sense. Power rested as much on personal relationships as on formal administration. Influential Roman families established lasting connections with provincial elites, creating networks of mutual benefit. After the capture of Syracuse in 212 BCE, for example, the powerful Claudii Marcelli family became patrons of the city. Sicilian aristocrats, in turn, actively sought friendships with prominent Roman senators, recognizing that political influence in Rome could be just as valuable as wealth at home. These relationships are vividly illustrated decades later by Cicero's famous prosecution of the corrupt governor Gaius Verres. His speeches reveal not only widespread abuses of power, but also how deeply provincial elites had become connected to Roman political life. Rome's early provinces therefore rested on a combination of military superiority, local cooperation, economic opportunity, and elite patronage. This flexible model would later become one of the defining characteristics of Roman imperial expansion throughout the Mediterranean. While Rome was consolidating its authority in the West, another frontier demanded attention across the Adriatic Sea. Many people associate Rome's rise as a Mediterranean superpower with its victory over Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Even the Greek historian Polybius viewed that conflict as the turning point in Roman history. Yet Rome had already begun projecting military power eastward years before Hannibal crossed the Alps. The catalyst was piracy. Merchant ships sailing between Greece and southern Italy faced constant attacks from Illyrian raiders. When Roman diplomatic envoys were murdered, the Senate decided that negotiation was no longer enough. In 229 BCE, Rome declared war on the Illyrian kingdom ruled by the Labiatae. Several Greek coastal cities sided with the Romans, providing valuable support. 2 Roman consular armies crossed the Adriatic, defeated the Illyrians within a single campaigning season, and imposed harsh peace terms. Territory was surrendered, tribute was demanded, and key ports such as Epidamnos, Apollonia, and the island of Corcyra entered Rome's sphere of protection. For the first time, Rome had established itself as a military guarantor along the eastern coast of the Adriatic. But peace proved short-lived. Only 10 years later, another Illyrian ruler abandoned his alliance with Rome and joined forces with Macedonia while once again threatening maritime trade. The Roman response was immediate. Another army crossed the sea, crushed the rebellion, and reinforced Roman dominance over the region. From that point onward, the Eastern Adriatic increasingly became part of Rome's strategic world. Modern archaeology helps us understand what these victories actually meant on the ground. The Adriatic coastline can broadly be divided into 2 very different regions. In the south, encompassing parts of modern Albania and Epirus, cities developed relatively late. Outside the long-established Greek colonies, indigenous settlements only began acquiring urban characteristics during the 3rd century BCE. Public squares, monumental temples, carefully planned streets, elegant courtyard houses, locally minted coins, and elected officials all appeared during this period, reflecting strong Greek cultural influence. Many communities also adopted the Greek alphabet and even Greek personal names. Politically, these cities served as the centers of small autonomous states known as koina. Although Illyrian kings attempted to extend their authority over them, these urban communities frequently pursued their own interests and often shifted alliances during Rome's campaigns, making the political landscape remarkably complex. Remarkably, these local political structures survived well into the 1st century BCE. Even during the civil wars between Julius Caesar and Pompey, military units from the region were still identified by their individual koina, demonstrating the persistence of local identities under Roman influence. Northern Illyria followed a very different path. Across much of what is now Croatia, fortified hilltop settlements remained the dominant form of habitation throughout the 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE. Large Roman-style cities were largely absent until much later. When urbanization finally arrived, however, it transformed the landscape with extraordinary speed. In some places, Rome founded entirely new towns. In others, existing settlements were expanded or completely rebuilt according to Roman urban planning principles. Ports became administrative centers, streets were reorganized into orderly grids, and monumental public buildings began replacing older structures. Parentium, modern Porech, illustrates this process particularly well. A Roman settlement was established directly over an older prehistoric community, taking advantage of its strategic harbor and its connections to inland trade routes. Similar developments occurred at Pola, Tarsatica, and several other important coastal centers, where Roman architecture reshaped long-established settlements without abandoning their strategic importance. Across the region, Rome employed several different approaches. Sometimes entirely new cities replaced older centers. In other cases, Roman suburbs gradually expanded alongside indigenous settlements before becoming dominant themselves. Elsewhere, Roman towns were deliberately constructed directly over earlier hilltop communities, preserving continuity while completely transforming their appearance. Meanwhile, many fortified settlements in the interior continued to exist, although their political and economic roles gradually changed. At first glance, these developments may seem contradictory. Some communities experienced rapid urban growth, while others remained largely unchanged. Yet together, they reveal Rome's broader strategy. Rather than occupying every territory with permanent armies, Rome relied heavily on treaties, alliances, and cooperation with local tribal elites. Military strength remained essential, but diplomacy often proved just as valuable. Long before Roman intervention, the peoples of the Eastern Adriatic had already begun evolving from small tribal communities into larger political organizations. Contact with Greek colonies and Celtic societies in Central Europe stimulated new forms of leadership, trade, and warfare. Archaeological discoveries of richly furnished warrior graves filled with prestigious weapons and luxury goods point to increasingly unequal societies led by powerful local elites. Rome did not create these transformations from nothing. Instead, it entered a region that was already changing and redirected those developments to serve its own expanding Mediterranean empire. As local communities along the Eastern Adriatic grew larger and more organized, powerful leaders began emerging at the head of these expanding populations. Supported by loyal armed followers, they were able to dominate wider territories than ever before. By the early 2nd century BCE, this growing authority was closely connected to trade. Local elites controlled valuable resources such as slaves, livestock, and animal hides, which were exchanged with Roman merchants through important trading centers like Aquileia and Nerona. In return, they received Mediterranean goods, including wine, olive oil, preserved fish, and other luxury products that enhanced both their wealth and their social prestige. It is during this same period that many of the tribal names familiar from Roman history first appear in ancient sources. Polybius mentions the Delmatae around 180 BCE, Livy refers to the Lapodes shortly afterward, and writers of the 2nd century BCE increasingly use the name Pannoni to describe various peoples living between the Sava and Drava rivers. These were not entirely new populations, but larger political groupings that had gradually formed through changing economic and social conditions. The rise of these regional powers reveals an interesting contradiction. Roman expansion actually encouraged stronger local leadership rather than eliminating it. Contact with Greek cities and Roman merchants created opportunities for ambitious chiefs to accumulate wealth and prestige, strengthening their authority over neighboring communities. Yet this authority remained fragile. Their power depended on maintaining the loyalty of other influential families while continuously acquiring new resources to reward supporters. For Rome, governing this region proved far from simple. Although Roman influence dominated much of the coastline, the interior remained politically fragmented and constantly shifting. Alliances changed quickly, rival groups fought one another for influence, and raids across neighboring territories remained common. Piracy continued to threaten shipping throughout the Adriatic, while the profitable slave trade supplied Mediterranean markets with captives taken during local conflicts. The result was a frontier where commerce, diplomacy, and violence existed side by side for generations. While the Eastern Adriatic remained unstable, an even greater conflict was about to reshape the Mediterranean. Only a short time after the Second Illyrian War, Rome and Carthage were once again drawn into open war. Unlike the struggles in Illyria, this confrontation involved the two greatest military powers in the Western Mediterranean. Their rivalry had already produced the costly First Punic War, but the second conflict would become even larger and more destructive. At the heart of the dispute stood the Iberian Peninsula. After losing Sicily to Rome, Carthage had rebuilt its strength by expanding into southern Spain, where rich silver mines, fertile farmland, and thriving trade routes offered enormous economic opportunities. The newly founded city of Kart Hadasht, known today as Cartagena, quickly developed into the center of Carthaginian power in Iberia. Rome watched these developments with increasing concern. Roman merchants became active in the region, diplomatic missions traveled between the two powers, and negotiations attempted to define their respective spheres of influence. Both Rome and Carthage sought to avoid direct confrontation, yet both also hoped to expand their own position along the Iberian coast. The uneasy balance finally collapsed in 218 BCE. The immediate trigger was the city of Saguntum. Although located within Carthage's sphere of influence, Saguntum claimed Rome as its ally. When Hannibal besieged and captured the city after months of resistance, the Roman Senate answered with a declaration of war. What began as a dispute over one coastal city soon developed into one of history's greatest military conflicts. Hannibal's daring march across the Alps stunned the Roman world. His victories at Lake Trasimene, and especially at Cannae, inflicted catastrophic losses on Rome and seemed to place the Republic on the verge of collapse. Yet while Hannibal campaigned across Italy, the struggle for Iberia remained equally important. Roman forces gradually gained the upper hand there. Under the leadership of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later celebrated as Scipio Africanus, they captured Qat Hadasht in 209 BCE, depriving Carthage of its principal base in Spain. Within only a few years, Carthaginian authority throughout Iberia collapsed. At the same time, Rome was making major advances elsewhere. Marcus Claudius Marcellus captured Syracuse in 212 BCE after a brutal siege, bringing all of Sicily firmly under Roman control. In southern Italy, cities that had sided with Hannibal were forced back into submission. One by one, Carthage's allies disappeared. The balance of the war had decisively shifted. Unable to secure final victory in Italy, Hannibal was eventually recalled to defend North Africa itself. There, in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated him at the Battle of Zama. The following year, Carthage accepted harsh peace terms. Its fleet was surrendered, enormous financial reparations were imposed, and every Carthaginian possession in Iberia was lost. By the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had become the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Ancient historians such as Polybius later regarded the Second Punic War as the turning point that launched Rome toward world domination. Yet victory had come at an extraordinary cost. The defeats suffered earlier in the conflict, especially at Cannae, were so devastating that they remained symbols of military disaster for centuries. Rome survived only because of its remarkable ability to mobilize manpower. The Republic could repeatedly recruit its own citizens, while also drawing upon thousands of soldiers supplied by its Italian allies. Year after year, this system allowed Rome to replace its losses and continue fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. Few rival states possessed resources on such a scale. This enormous military capacity soon carried Rome beyond the Western Mediterranean. Even before the war with Carthage had ended, another struggle was unfolding across the Adriatic. As Roman influence expanded into Illyria, the Macedonian king Philip V increasingly viewed Roman intervention as a direct threat. Competition over the eastern Adriatic soon developed into open warfare during the Second Punic War itself. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, and the peace agreement concluded in 205 BCE changed little on the battlefield. Diplomatically, however, Rome emerged in a stronger position. An alliance with the Kingdom of Pergamon secured valuable naval support and strengthened Roman influence throughout the Adriatic and Aegean seas. These developments marked the beginning of Rome's deeper involvement in the politics of the Hellenistic East. Rather than following a carefully planned strategy of conquest, Rome entered a rapidly changing political landscape where rival kingdoms competed for dominance. As alliances shifted and old balances of power collapsed, Roman intervention became increasingly frequent, setting the stage for an entirely new phase of Mediterranean history. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean changed dramatically in 204 BCE with the unexpected death of Ptolemy IV of Egypt. His successor, Ptolemy V, was only 6 years old, inheriting a kingdom already shaken by years of rebellion as native Egyptians challenged the rule of the Greek Macedonian elite. For generations, the Ptolemies had relied on Egypt's immense agricultural wealth, an efficient tax system, and one of the strongest fleets in the Mediterranean. Their army was powerful enough to rival even the vast Seleucid Empire. But with the kingdom descending into instability, that military strength quickly began to fade. For decades, the Eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by three great dynasties: the Antigonids in Macedon, the Seleucids in the Near East, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Now, with Egypt weakened, a dangerous power vacuum emerged. Sensing an opportunity, King Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire formed an alliance, hoping to divide the Ptolemaic possessions between them before Egypt could recover. This plan alarmed many smaller states across the Greek world. Pergamon and Rhodes understood that if the two monarchs succeeded, the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean would collapse. Seeking protection, their ambassadors traveled to Rome in 201 BCE, appealing to the republic that had just emerged victorious from the Second Punic War. At first, many Romans hesitated. The republic had only recently survived its exhausting struggle against Hannibal, and another major war seemed deeply unpopular. But supporters of intervention argued that Philip V had already threatened Roman interests in Illyria only a few years earlier. Eventually, the Senate adopted a firm position. Rome delivered an ultimatum. Philip was ordered to stop attacking Greek cities, abandon his campaign against the Ptolemaic kingdom, and answer for his actions against Pergamon and Rhodes. If he refused, Rome would declare war. The message reflected a new confidence. Only a few years earlier, Rome had been fighting for survival against Hannibal. Now it was dictating terms to one of the most powerful kings in the Greek world. Philip rejected the ultimatum. In 200 BCE, Roman armies crossed the Adriatic once again, landing at Apollonia before advancing into Greece. The mountainous landscape made campaigning slow and difficult, and for nearly 2 years, neither side achieved a decisive advantage. The breakthrough finally came under the command of Titus Quinctius Flamininus, who successfully forced his way through western Greece and confronted Philip's army at the Battle of Cynocephali in 197 BCE. The battle ended in a crushing Roman victory. Philip was forced to surrender his conquests, pay a heavy indemnity of 1,000 talents of silver, and dramatically reduce the size of his navy. Yet Rome sought something even more valuable than territory. At the Isthmian Games in Corinth in 196 BCE, Flamininus made a dramatic announcement before a vast Greek audience. He proclaimed that all Greek cities were now free and independent. The declaration won enormous applause, and Flamininus was celebrated throughout Greece as a liberator. Behind the powerful symbolism, however, Rome had achieved something far greater than military victory. Without formally annexing large territories, the Republic had established itself as the dominant political power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Philip's defeat transformed the strategic landscape. Attention soon shifted toward Asia Minor and the Aegean, where Antiochus III now sought to fill the vacuum left by the weakening of both Macedon and Egypt. The Seleucid king hoped not only to recover former Ptolemaic territories, but also to extend his authority into mainland Greece itself. Rome had no intention of allowing another great monarchy to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. Although the Senate still preferred alliances and indirect influence over outright conquest, relations with Antiochus rapidly deteriorated. Regional powers accelerated the crisis. The Aetolian League, dissatisfied with Rome's growing influence, actively encouraged Antiochus to invade Greece. At the same time, Roman intelligence received disturbing reports that Hannibal, now living in exile after losing favor in Carthage, had entered the service of Antiochus and was encouraging resistance against Rome. These developments convinced the Senate that another war was becoming unavoidable. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to assess the situation, military preparations intensified, and by 192 BCE Rome was once again preparing for a major conflict in the Greek world. The spark that ignited the war came from the increasingly unstable political situation within Greece itself. Rivalries among the Greek states created an opportunity that Antiochus could not resist. Crossing into Greece with his army, he occupied Demetrius in Thessaly, hoping to rally support against Rome. The Roman response was immediate. Fresh armies crossed into Illyria while reinforcements assembled across Italy. Fighting spread through central and western Greece, gradually forcing Antiochus to abandon the mainland and retreat into Asia Minor. The conflict then shifted to the sea. Supported by its allies Pergamon and Rhodes, Rome sought control of the Aegean. Victory in the naval battle of Myonessus in 190 BCE opened the route into Western Asia Minor, allowing Roman forces to pursue Antiochus directly. Soon afterward, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, assisted by his famous brother Publius Scipio Africanus, met the Seleucid king near Magnesia. The battle proved decisive. Antiochus suffered a catastrophic defeat, destroying any realistic hope of resisting Roman expansion. He immediately sought negotiations, sending trusted representatives to discuss peace, while Rome continued consolidating its position. At the same time, another Roman army under Gnaeus Manlius Vulso marched into central Anatolia against the Galatians. Originally Celtic mercenaries who had settled in the region generations earlier, the Galatians had built powerful warrior communities and repeatedly raided neighboring kingdoms. Their support for Antiochus now brought swift Roman retaliation. Vulso's successful campaign demonstrated that Rome intended to punish not only its principal enemies, but also any regional powers willing to oppose its authority. The final settlement came with the Treaty of Apamea. Its terms permanently reshaped the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus surrendered every Seleucid possession west of the Taurus Mountains, with Pergamon and Rhodes receiving much of the conquered territory. He was forced to pay an enormous indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver, a sum even greater than the reparations imposed on Carthage after Hannibal's defeat. His military was drastically reduced, much of his fleet was surrendered, and he was forbidden from conducting military operations in the Aegean or on the European mainland. The consequences reached far beyond the Seleucid kingdom. For more than a century after Alexander the Great's death, the eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by competing Hellenistic monarchies. The victories over Philip V and Antiochus III brought that era to an end. None of the traditional great kingdoms could now challenge Roman authority. Without formally ruling every land it influenced, Rome had become the unquestioned superpower of the Mediterranean world. While Rome was reshaping the eastern Mediterranean through diplomacy and strategic alliances, its expansion in the west followed a very different path. The Iberian Peninsula presented unique challenges. Its rugged mountains, broad river valleys, and fragmented geography created several distinct regions that required different approaches to conquest and control. By the end of the Second Punic War, Rome firmly controlled much of the Mediterranean coastline in eastern and southern Iberia, as well as the fertile Guadalquivir Valley in the south. This river system provided a natural route deep into the interior, making the region comparatively easy to administer and exploit. The eastern coast, however, was a different story. Mountain ranges separated the coast from the central plateau, limiting access inland. Only the Ebro River Valley offered a practical corridor through which Roman armies could push farther into the peninsula. Recognizing these geographical realities, Rome reorganized its new possessions in 197 BCE into two provinces. Hispania Citerior covered the northern regions, while Hispania Ulterior governed the south. Although connected by a relatively narrow coastal strip, each province faced different military and administrative challenges. The conquest of Iberia was far from complete. For decades, Roman governors fought almost continuous campaigns against Celtiberian tribes and other indigenous peoples who fiercely resisted Roman rule. Every few years, experienced former consuls and praetors were assigned to command the provinces, reflecting how important the struggle had become. Between 195 and 175 BCE alone, Roman victories in Spain earned 8 triumphal celebrations in Rome. These campaigns also generated enormous wealth. Precious metals, livestock, slaves, and other spoils poured into Italy, while victorious commanders returned with vast quantities of silver and gold captured from the peninsula. Roman strategy relied on relentless military pressure. Armies devastated farmland, destroyed harvests, and systematically targeted heavily fortified indigenous strongholds known as oppida. Although warfare had always been part of Iberian history, Roman campaigns reached an entirely different scale. Modern archaeology has revealed just how devastating these operations were. One striking example comes from Castellet de Bagnole in modern Catalonia. This strongly defended settlement met a violent end during the early 2nd century BCE. Excavations uncovered burned buildings, collapsed defensive walls, hidden valuables abandoned by fleeing inhabitants, and large numbers of weapons scattered throughout the site. Even more revealing were Roman catapult projectiles embedded inside the settlement and the remains of a Roman military camp nearby, leaving little doubt about who carried out the attack. An even more disturbing picture emerges from Cerro de la Cruz in southern Spain. Destroyed sometime between 150 and 130 BCE, the settlement preserves direct evidence of extreme violence. Archaeologists discovered the skeletons of numerous inhabitants lying unburied in the streets. Many bore deep sword wounds, with injuries showing that some victims had been repeatedly struck even after death. Entire sections of the settlement were abandoned following the massacre, suggesting that the surviving population either fled or was forcibly removed. These discoveries closely match descriptions left by ancient historians. Polybius explained that Roman armies often followed a deliberate practice when capturing enemy towns. Before looting began, soldiers were ordered to kill every living inhabitant. According to him, conquered settlements frequently contained not only human corpses, but also slaughtered animals scattered through the streets, creating scenes designed to inspire absolute terror. Archaeological evidence increasingly confirms that such massacres were not isolated incidents, but a recurring feature of Roman warfare in Iberia. Only exceptionally brutal actions, such as the massacre carried out by Servius Sulpicius Galba against disarmed Lusitanians, including women and children, provoked criticism even within Rome itself. Conquest, however, was only the first step. Once territories had been subdued, Rome moved quickly to exploit their economic potential. Roads and ports expanded commercial networks, but nothing proved more valuable than Iberia's extraordinary mineral wealth. The silver mines became one of Rome's greatest economic assets. Scientific research has even detected traces of this massive mining operation thousands of kilometers away. Lead pollution preserved in Greenland's ice sheets shows a dramatic increase beginning around 150 BCE, and most of that contamination has been traced directly to the Roman-controlled mines of southern Spain. Ancient writers also describe the astonishing scale of production. Polybius reported that around 40,000 laborers, many of them slaves, worked the mines near Carthago Nova. Together, they extracted enormous quantities of silver every single day. Over the course of a year, production reached tens of tons of precious metal, generating wealth so immense that within only a few years it equaled the huge indemnities once imposed on Carthage after the Second Punic War and later on the Seleucid Empire following the Treaty of Apamea. Managing this vast industry required both the Roman state and private enterprise. Large public contracting companies, known as Societates Publicanorum, operated alongside smaller Italian entrepreneurs eager to profit from the booming mining economy. The promise of extraordinary fortunes attracted merchants, investors, and settlers from across Italy. Contemporary writers claimed that successful mine operators could earn staggering amounts of money in remarkably short periods. Inscriptions found on lead ingots from Cartagena preserve the names of numerous Italian families who established themselves in the region, while archaeological discoveries reveal a sharp increase in imported Italian pottery, reflecting the rapid growth of these new communities. Yet behind this remarkable prosperity lay immense human suffering. The wealth flowing into Rome depended almost entirely on slave labor. Thousands of men were forced underground into dangerous tunnels where they worked day and night under brutal conditions. Ancient authors describe relentless supervision, constant physical punishment, and exhausting labor with virtually no opportunity for rest. Many slaves never emerged from the mines alive, dying from exhaustion, injuries, or the unbearable conditions beneath the earth. For Rome, Iberia became one of the richest provinces in the Mediterranean. Its silver-financed armies enriched senators and businessmen and strengthened the republic's growing power. But for countless indigenous communities and enslaved workers, Roman conquest brought destruction, displacement, and exploitation on a scale that permanently transformed the peninsula. As Rome tightened its grip on Hispania through military conquest and economic exploitation, it also began reshaping the landscape itself. Urban planning became one of the Republic's most effective tools for consolidating control. The new cities founded across the peninsula did more than provide places to live. They reflected a distinctly Roman vision of order, administration, and public life. This transformation did not happen overnight. In many cities, recognizably, Roman architecture would not fully appear until the 1st century BCE. Even so, the foundations of Roman urbanism were laid much earlier. Carefully planned street grids, organized road networks, defensive walls, and designated public spaces established the framework upon which later generations would build. Corduba, modern Cordoba, illustrates this gradual evolution. By the 2nd century BCE, the city already possessed a regular street plan, a central forum, and impressive defensive walls enclosing more than 40 hectares. Yet despite this orderly layout, everyday life still looked remarkably local. Houses continued to be built from mud brick, roof tiles were largely absent, and domestic architecture closely resembled older Iberian traditions. Only in the following century did more recognizably Roman features, such as tiled roofs, plastered walls, and painted interiors, begin to transform the city's appearance. A similar pattern can be seen at Carthago Nova. Although firmly under Roman rule, much of the city continued to preserve its Punic architectural character for decades. Roman influence initially appeared only in selected monumental buildings, particularly temples and public terraces, while ordinary neighborhoods retained their traditional layout and construction methods. Perhaps the clearest example of deliberate Roman city planning can be found at Emporiae on the northeastern coast. Rather than replacing the long-established Greek settlement of Emporion, Rome constructed an entirely new town beside it during the late 2nd century BCE. Everything about the new settlement reflected careful planning. The streets formed a precise rectangular grid with residential blocks measured according to standard Roman units of land. At the heart of the city stood an imposing forum designed as the political, commercial, and religious center of urban life. A grand Capitoline temple dominated the square, surrounded by elegant double porticos that echoed some of central Italy's most prestigious sanctuaries. The forum incorporated architectural features that had become characteristic of Roman cities. Covered underground passageways known as cryptoporticos provided cool storage spaces while also serving commercial and public functions. Shops lined one side of the square, broad streets crossed through the center, and a basilica offered space for legal proceedings, financial transactions, and civic administration. Together, these elements created an urban environment that was unmistakably Roman. Yet, Romanization remained far from uniform. Across southern Hispania, particularly in territories that had once belonged to Carthage, Punic, Iberian, and Roman traditions coexisted for generations. Local building styles survived alongside Roman public architecture. Everyday objects reflected multiple cultural influences, while burial customs often continued according to long-established local traditions. Even major indigenous centers such as Tarraco preserved much of their earlier character well into the late 2nd century BCE. Looking beyond the cities reveals an even more complex picture. Recent archaeological research in the valleys of the Guadalquivir and Ebro rivers shows that Roman rule produced a wide variety of local experiences. Some indigenous settlements disappeared entirely, while others adapted, expanded, or continued largely unchanged. Segeda provides one of the best examples of Rome's selective use of overwhelming force. Located in the Ebro Valley, the Celtiberian stronghold had officially accepted Roman authority decades earlier. Around 154 BCE, however, its inhabitants dramatically expanded the settlement, constructing massive new defensive walls while nearby communities abandoned their own villages to concentrate their population inside the growing city. Archaeological excavations have confirmed these ancient accounts, revealing rapid urban expansion and the remains of the impressive fortifications that alarmed Rome. The Senate interpreted this development as a direct challenge. War followed immediately. Although the people of Segeda initially resisted with the support of neighboring Celtiberian tribes, Roman armies eventually overwhelmed the city and destroyed it completely. Its story, however, did not end there. A new settlement soon arose beside the ruins. The inhabitants continued minting coins bearing the traditional local name and wrote in the Celtiberian language using their own script. At the same time, the rebuilt city's walls, streets, and houses displayed unmistakable Roman and Italic architectural influence. This combination reveals the complex reality of Roman conquest. The local population attempted to preserve its cultural identity while adapting to a political and economic system increasingly dominated by Rome. Daily life, patterns of consumption, and urban organization gradually became more closely tied to Roman administration, even as local traditions survived. Other communities experienced a different kind of transformation. At Giribaile in the Guadalimar Valley, the main hilltop settlement remained occupied after the Roman conquest, avoiding the destruction suffered by places like Segeda. Yet, continuity did not mean stability. During the 2nd century BCE, numerous smaller farming settlements appeared throughout the surrounding countryside. These new communities remained connected to the central oppidum, but were strategically established on the region's most fertile agricultural land. Archaeologists believe this reorganization was driven directly by Roman demands. Traditional patterns of farming no longer produced enough surplus to satisfy the taxes and tribute imposed by provincial authorities. To meet these obligations, more land had to be cultivated and agricultural production intensified. As families spread across the countryside, the structure of the local community gradually changed, creating new economic relationships and likely altering the balance of social power. Local elites played a central role in this process. Their authority increasingly depended on maintaining productive relationships with Roman governors, encouraging them to reorganize agriculture and ensure that tribute continued flowing to the Republic. Across Hispania, therefore, Roman rule transformed far more than political boundaries. Cities were redesigned, landscapes reorganized, economies redirected, and traditional communities reshaped in ways that permanently altered life throughout the peninsula. Yet, these changes rarely erased local identities altogether. Instead, Roman institutions and indigenous traditions often developed side by side, producing a complex and deeply interconnected provincial society. Roman rule in Hispania was shaped by more than conquest, resistance, and political cooperation. Over time, another process quietly transformed the province: cultural and biological integration. Decades of military occupation brought Roman soldiers into close contact with local communities, and relationships between Roman men and Iberian women became increasingly common. A remarkable episode recorded by Livy illustrates this change. In 171 BCE, around 4,000 sons born to Roman soldiers and Iberian mothers appealed to the Senate for legal recognition and the right to live as citizens within a Roman community. Rome responded by elevating the settlement of Cartaia, near modern Gibraltar, to the status of a Latin colony, allowing these men to receive Roman citizenship. Only 30 years after Roman armies first arrived in Iberia, the conquest had already begun creating an entirely new population that belonged to both worlds. Yet integration did not bring lasting stability. Throughout the 2nd century BCE, large parts of the Iberian Peninsula remained locked in almost continuous warfare. Roman writers often described these conflicts as rebellions, but in reality, they were organized regional wars fought by clearly defined political communities defending their independence. In many ways, they resembled later colonial frontier wars rather than isolated uprisings. One of the largest conflicts erupted in 154 BCE, drawing together Celtiberian and Lusitanian peoples across southern and central Iberia. Fighting gradually spread through the valleys of the Ebro and Duero rivers, engulfing territories that had already been claimed by Rome. The conflict was temporarily contained by Marcus Claudius Martellus, a distinguished Roman commander and grandson of the famous general who had captured Syracuse during the Second Punic War. Marcellus attempted to capture the powerful Celtiberian stronghold of Numantia, but instead negotiated a temporary peace. During the same period, he also founded the Roman city of Corduba, strengthening Rome's long-term presence in southern Iberia. The peace, however, proved short-lived. During the 140s BCE, Roman armies suffered a series of embarrassing defeats. Rather than withdrawing, the Senate intensified the war despite increasing difficulties recruiting soldiers willing to serve in the harsh conditions of Hispania. Roman campaigns now concentrated on two principal targets: the Lusitanians in western Iberia and the fiercely independent city of Numantia. The Lusitanians were eventually defeated after the relentless campaigns of Decimus Junius Brutus in 136 BCE. Numantia, however, continued resisting even after neighboring communities had fallen. The task of ending that resistance fell to Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. Determined to avoid costly assaults, Scipio surrounded Numantia completely, cutting off every route of supply until starvation forced the defenders to surrender. The city was then systematically destroyed, and the surviving inhabitants were sold into slavery, bringing one of the longest and most determined resistance movements in Roman Spain to a brutal conclusion. While these wars raged across Iberia, Rome's influence was also expanding northward into southern Gaul. Before the formal creation of the province of Gallia Narbonensis, Rome possessed few permanent military bases in the region. Nevertheless, archaeological discoveries reveal that Roman and Italian merchants had already established extensive commercial networks long before direct political control arrived. Trade followed the great river systems flowing from the Mediterranean into the Gallic interior. Among the most profitable exports was Italian wine. Celtic elites eagerly purchased wine imported from Etruria, Latium, and Campania, while one of the principal commodities exchanged in return was slaves captured within Gaul itself. The scale of this commerce is visible in numerous shipwrecks discovered along the Ligurian coast and southern France. Cargoes of Italian wine amphorae have also been uncovered throughout the Rhone Valley and even as far as Brittany, demonstrating how deeply Mediterranean trade had penetrated Western Europe during the 2nd century BCE. The trade became so significant that the Roman Senate reportedly attempted to restrict the cultivation of vineyards and olive groves beyond the Alps in order to protect Italian producers. Wine was only part of a much broader cultural exchange. Italian merchants also brought finely crafted tableware from Campania, and these imported vessels gradually transformed elite dining habits in southern Gaul. Traditional Celtic communities had previously relied on relatively simple pottery with little variation in shape or function. Social prestige at feasts depended largely on the amount of food and drink provided. Italian ceramics introduced something entirely new. Their wide variety of bowls, cups, plates, and serving vessels allowed local aristocrats to imitate Mediterranean banquets, where status was displayed not simply through abundance, but through elaborate rituals, refined presentation, and carefully structured social hierarchy. Possessing imported Roman tableware became a visible symbol of wealth, sophistication, and political influence. Commerce, however, did not eliminate conflict. Because of its long-standing alliance with the Greek city of Massalia, modern Marseille, Rome was repeatedly drawn into military campaigns in southern Gaul. In 181 BCE, Massalia requested Roman assistance against Ligurian pirates threatening maritime trade. Several decades later, another Roman army devastated the territories of neighboring Ligurian tribes. The decisive turning point came in 125 BCE. Once again responding to appeals from Massalia, Roman commanders launched major campaigns against the Vocontii and Saluvii. After several years of fighting, numerous indigenous strongholds were destroyed, large numbers of survivors were enslaved, and extensive territories were annexed. This victory marked the end of Rome's earlier strategy of indirect influence. The conquered region was reorganized into the province of Gallia Narbonensis, while the foundation of the colony of Narbo Martius in 118 BCE established a permanent Roman administrative center along the Mediterranean coast. The expansion of Roman authority in Iberia and southern Gaul therefore cannot be understood as a single, straightforward conquest. Roman power spread through a constantly shifting combination of military force, diplomacy, economic integration, settlement, and cultural exchange. Some coastal cities prospered through trade with Italy and became increasingly connected to the wider Mediterranean economy. Other regions endured repeated campaigns, destruction, forced resettlement, and slavery. Elsewhere, indigenous elites chose cooperation, adapting to Roman rule in hopes of preserving their own authority and securing advantages for their communities. The Western Mediterranean thus became a patchwork of very different experiences under Roman domination. Prosperity and violence, opportunity and exploitation, integration and resistance all existed side by side, shaping the provinces that would become some of the Republic's most important possessions. Rome's relationship with the great Hellenistic kingdoms developed very differently from its expansion in the Western Mediterranean. In Iberia, conquest was marked by constant frontier warfare and gradual occupation. In the Greek East, diplomacy played a far greater role. Rome viewed the powerful kingdoms of Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt as serious rivals rather than territories to be immediately absorbed. Instead of outright annexation, the Senate relied on alliances with Greek cities, regional leagues, and smaller kingdoms to maintain a balance of power while limiting the influence of larger monarchies. That balance did not last. When Philip V of Macedon died in 179 BCE, his son Perseus inherited the throne with ambitious plans to restore Macedonian strength. He reorganized the kingdom, strengthened its military, and sought to rebuild the influence that Macedon had steadily lost after its defeat by Rome. These developments alarmed Rome's allies. In 172 BCE, King Eumenes II of Pergamon personally traveled to Rome, warning the Senate that Perseus represented a growing danger. He even raised the possibility that a revived Macedon could once again threaten Italy itself. Around the same time, a delegation of allied Greeks was reportedly attacked, and Eumenes narrowly survived an assassination attempt while returning from Delphi. Whether Perseus had any direct involvement remained uncertain, but the incidents strengthened the argument for military intervention. Backed by a broad coalition of Greek allies, Rome prepared for war. The conflict began in 171 BCE and spread across northern Greece, Illyria, and the surrounding Balkan regions. For several years, neither side gained a decisive advantage. That changed dramatically in 168 BCE when the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus confronted Perseus at the Battle of Pydna beneath the slopes of Mount Olympus. The result transformed the ancient world. The Macedonian army was crushed, Perseus was defeated, and the kingdom founded by Philip II and expanded by Alexander the Great effectively ceased to exist. In a single campaign, Rome eliminated the last great successor state capable of challenging its authority in the Balkans. Yet even after such a victory, Rome showed little interest in immediate annexation. Instead, Macedon was divided into 4 separate political units, governed by local officials under Roman supervision. Unlike Hispania, where Rome rapidly exploited mineral wealth, the rich Macedonian mines were temporarily closed. Timber from the royal forests was likewise placed under strict restrictions rather than immediately opened to Roman contractors. The Senate appeared more interested in preventing the rapid recovery of Macedonian power than in extracting immediate profits. Elsewhere, however, Roman policy was far harsher. In Epirus, Lucius Aemilius Paulus ordered one of the most devastating punitive campaigns the Republic had yet carried out. 70 cities were systematically plundered, and their inhabitants were enslaved. Entire communities disappeared almost overnight. Similar devastation struck parts of Illyria, whose king Genthios had supported Perseus before the final Roman victory. These contrasting approaches reveal how geography shaped Roman strategy. Western Greece, Epirus, and Illyria occupied the routes linking Italy with the Balkans across the Adriatic. From strongholds such as Corcyra, Apollonia, and Dyrrhachium, Rome controlled the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, as well as the principal land routes running along the coast and through the river valleys leading inland. These corridors possessed enormous strategic value. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Via Egnatia connected Dyrrhachium and Apollonia with Thessalonica, creating the most practical east-west route across the rugged Balkan Peninsula. For centuries afterward, this road remained one of southeastern Europe's most important transportation arteries. Macedon itself occupied a different geographical world. Its economy was oriented toward the northeastern Aegean rather than the Adriatic. Rich mineral deposits and extensive forests supported mining and shipbuilding, while rivers flowing toward the Aegean connected the kingdom with its principal ports. Because transporting heavy goods across mountains remained slow and expensive, maritime routes carried most trade between Macedon and Italy. Control of the Adriatic gateway therefore became one of Rome's greatest strategic advantages. Following the destruction of the Macedonian kingdom, the Senate pursued two complementary policies. In western Greece and Epirus, Rome deliberately prevented the emergence of another strong regional power. Military interventions, shifting alliances, and support for ambitious local leaders, such as the notoriously ruthless Charops, kept the region politically fragmented. Rather than occupying every territory directly, Rome ensured that no rival coalition could establish lasting stability. At the same time, economic links with Macedon steadily expanded. Although the mines initially remained closed, they were reopened in 158 BCE under the management of Roman tax contractors, allowing Roman business interests to profit from the kingdom's natural resources. Trade soon became just as important as military power. A key turning point came in 166 BCE with the establishment of Delos as a free port. Officially, the decision was intended to weaken Rhodes, whose commercial influence had long dominated the eastern Aegean. By eliminating customs duties on Delos, Rome redirected merchants toward the small island almost overnight. The consequences were extraordinary. Within only a few years, Delos developed into the busiest commercial center in the Aegean Sea. Although formally administered by Athens, much of its economic life came under the control of Roman and Italian merchants, whose trading associations established a dominant presence on the island. From Delos, goods moved across the entire Mediterranean. Commercial links connected Italy with Macedon, Greece, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean, while merchants handled everything from grain and luxury goods to metals and manufactured products. Its greatest expansion, however, came somewhat later. After the destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE and the creation of the Roman province of Asia in 129 BCE, Delos emerged as the principal commercial hub linking Italy with the wealthy markets of the eastern Mediterranean. Ancient geographer Strabo later described the island as so active that tens of thousands of slaves could reportedly be bought and sold there in a single day. Whether or not that figure was exaggerated, it reflected a deeper reality. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome's growing political influence was increasingly matched by its economic dominance. Military victories had opened the door, but commerce, finance, and maritime trade now bound the Mediterranean together under Roman leadership. The Republic was no longer simply the strongest military power in the region. It had become the center of an economic network stretching from Spain to the Levant. Although Delos later became famous as the commercial crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, its earliest importance lay elsewhere. During the decades immediately following its designation as a free port in 166 BCE, the island served primarily as the key link between Italy and Macedon, rather than as the principal gateway to Egypt or Asia Minor. This development was closely connected to geography. Following Rome's victory at Pydna, Macedon's economy naturally looked toward the northern Aegean. Any large-scale movement of goods between Italy and Macedon depended on efficient maritime routes, and Roman merchants quickly recognized the strategic value of the western Cyclades. Their presence in the region actually predated the creation of the free port. Roman and Italic businessmen were already active on islands such as Tenos, Thera, Melos, and Naxos during the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE. One example is Timon of Syracuse, a banker who helped finance grain purchases for the people of Tenos around 192 BCE. His activities demonstrate that Roman economic influence had already begun spreading through the Aegean long before Delos rose to prominence. The establishment of the free port transformed these scattered commercial connections into a single integrated network. Delos rapidly became the central hub linking Italy with Macedon and the northern Aegean. Geography played a decisive role in this success. Seasonal winds in the Aegean favored ships sailing eastward from Italy, while the return journey was considerably more difficult. Merchants therefore preferred coastal routes through the western Cyclades before deciding whether to continue around the Peloponnese or cross the Isthmus of Corinth. Corinth possessed an enormous strategic advantage because ships could be hauled across the narrow isthmus along the famous Diolkos, avoiding the long voyage around southern Greece. But this shortcut came at a price. Corinth charged substantial fees for transporting ships overland, increasing both costs and congestion. For many merchants, Delos offered a more attractive alternative. Although voyages through Delos could sometimes take slightly longer in one direction, they avoided the expensive transit charges at Corinth and proved particularly efficient for ships sailing east from Italy. As a result, the free port strengthened Roman commercial expansion into the Aegean far more than it facilitated the reverse movement of eastern goods toward Italy. The impact was immediate. Excavations on Delos reveal growing quantities of Italian imports shortly after the island became a free port. Among the most recognizable discoveries are black-glazed ceramics known as Campana A. At first glance, these vessels might appear to represent a major pottery trade, but archaeological evidence suggests something different. The number of ceramic finds is actually too small to indicate large-scale commercial exports. Instead, scholars believe these wares arrived as secondary cargo aboard ships primarily transporting Italian wine and olive oil. Their presence therefore reflects the rapid expansion of Italy's export economy rather than a booming market for pottery itself. This interpretation is supported by discoveries across the eastern Mediterranean. Between roughly 160 and 140 BCE, imports of Italian wine and olive oil increased dramatically throughout the Aegean and the Levant. Campana pottery accompanied these cargoes, appearing at sites such as Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, Tanos, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, and North Africa. One pattern stands out. Despite the enormous growth in Mediterranean trade, Italian tableware remained remarkably rare in Asia Minor during the 2nd century BCE. This distribution confirms that Delos initially functioned primarily as a commercial center connecting Italy with Greece and Macedon, rather than with the eastern provinces beyond the Aegean. The inscriptions discovered on the Cycladic Islands reinforce the same conclusion. Roman and Italic merchants became increasingly visible during the 2nd century BCE, but they did not establish large permanent colonies. Instead, they formed highly mobile business communities made up of bankers, moneylenders, tax contractors, and merchants who moved wherever commercial opportunities appeared. The destruction of the Macedonian kingdom greatly accelerated this process. Archaeological discoveries show that Italian ceramics reached not only Delos, but also important Macedonian cities such as Pella and Stobi, both connected to the fertile Axios River valley. These finds reveal Rome's broader objective, establishing a reliable maritime trade corridor linking southern Macedon directly with the Adriatic and, ultimately, with Italy itself. Written evidence tells a similar story. Roman merchants appear frequently in inscriptions from Apollonia, Dyrrhachium, the Via Egnatia, and settlements throughout the Macedonian frontier. They were certainly involved in transporting metals, timber, and agricultural goods, but another commodity proved equally important: slaves. The Balkans became one of Rome's principal sources of enslaved labor. Polybius already noted that regions around the Black Sea exported slaves alongside livestock, fish, wax, and honey. Archaeological discoveries suggest that the northern Aegean formed an essential part of this commercial network. One remarkable piece of evidence survives in the tombstone of Aulus Caprelius Timotheos, a Roman slave trader from Amphipolis. The relief decorating his monument vividly illustrates his profession. One register depicts men carrying large storage jars and wine amphorae, while another shows groups of men, women, and children bound together by ropes around their necks. Since the accompanying inscription explicitly identifies Caprelius as a slave dealer, The imagery almost certainly represents the exchange of Mediterranean products, such as wine and olive oil, for enslaved people gathered from the Balkan interior. Ancient writers describe precisely this kind of trade. Strabo records that Roman merchants exchanged wine and textiles for slaves and animal skins in the region surrounding the Black Sea. The Amphipolis monument suggests that a similar commercial system also operated farther west, drawing captives from Thrace and neighboring territories before transporting them toward Mediterranean markets. Archaeology confirms just how extensive these networks became. Large numbers of Roman silver coins have been discovered throughout present-day Romania and the lower Danube basin. Many historians believe these coins represent payments made by Roman merchants purchasing slaves from local communities. Statistical studies indicate that this influx of Roman currency increased dramatically during the early 1st century BCE, illustrating how deeply Rome's commercial influence had penetrated into southeastern Europe. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Delos had become far more than a prosperous island port. It stood at the center of an expanding economic system that connected Italy with Macedon, Greece, the Balkans, and eventually the wider eastern Mediterranean. Through its harbors flowed wine, olive oil, metals, timber, luxury goods, and countless enslaved people. Military victories had secured Roman influence, but commerce transformed that influence into lasting Mediterranean dominance. Rome's victory over Macedon transformed the Eastern Balkans far beyond the immediate collapse of the Antigonid monarchy. Political events, such as the execution of dynasties or the promotion of local strongmen, were dramatic but temporary. The deeper change came through the gradual destruction of older economic and cultural systems. After a brief pause, Macedonian mines and forests were open to Roman exploitation. Italian merchants brought silver coinage, wine, and olive oil into the region while carrying metals, timber, and enslaved people back toward the Adriatic and Italy. Rome did not need to occupy every territory directly. Instead, it created a network of economic dependence in which peripheral regions supplied the Republic with raw materials and human labor. This process moved primarily from west to east. Italian ceramics, wine, and oil spread into Greece and the northern Aegean, while Delos continued to connect Macedon with the Adriatic. Military conquest had opened the region, but merchants, contractors, and slave traders made Roman influence permanent. At the same time, the Senate became increasingly involved in central Greece, particularly with the Achaean League, which united many of the major cities of the Peloponnese and the Greek mainland. This region was strategically vital because the routes from Roman-controlled Epirus led toward Aetolia, the Gulf of Corinth, and the northwestern Peloponnese. Stability there was also essential for maintaining communication with Macedon, yet Macedon itself remained unstable. In 148 BCE, a pretender named Andriscus claimed to be the son of Perseus and declared himself King Philip VI. The first Roman army sent against him was defeated, and its commander was killed. A second force under Quintus Caecilius Metellus eventually crushed the rebellion and captured Andriscus. But the uprising encouraged anti-Roman factions elsewhere in Greece. Tensions quickly spread through the cities of the Achaean League. Local politicians used hostility toward Rome against their pro-Roman rivals, creating a situation that appeared increasingly dangerous to the Senate. In 147 BCE, Rome demanded that several major cities, including Sparta, Corinth, Argos, Heraclea, and Orchomenos, leave the League. Such a measure would have effectively destroyed the Confederation. Although later Roman envoys tried to soften the demand, the intention was clear. Rome wanted to weaken the League, separate the Peloponnese from central Greece, and secure control of the Gulf of Corinth. Corinth stood at the center of this strategy. Its position on the isthmus allowed it to control the land route between the Peloponnese and mainland Greece, while its two ports connected the Adriatic with the Aegean. Just as Corcyra guarded the entrance to the Adriatic, Corinth controlled the central gateway between east and west. When the Achaean League rejected Roman demands, war followed. The conflict was brief. Metellus defeated the Achaean army in central Greece, while a second Roman force under Lucius Mummius landed in the Peloponnese and won another decisive victory near Corinth. After a siege lasting only a few days, the city fell in 146 BCE. The punishment was devastating. The remaining men were killed, women and children were enslaved, buildings were burned, fortifications were demolished, and artworks were carried away as war booty. Archaeological excavations confirm the scale of the destruction. Sanctuaries, workshops, public buildings, and houses were abandoned or deliberately ruined, while local pottery production, sculpture, and coinage largely disappeared. Some people continued living around the isthmus, probably working as tenants on land owned by Roman elites, but Corinth ceased to exist as a major political and commercial center. The same year brought an equally dramatic destruction in the Western Mediterranean. Although Carthage had completed the payment of its war indemnity in 151 BCE, its economic recovery continued to alarm Rome. The Senate repeatedly restricted. Carthaginian freedom of action, while neighboring Numidia, provoked a series of border disputes. When Carthage finally defended itself militarily, Rome treated the action as a violation of the peace treaty. In 149 BCE, a Roman army of roughly 80,000 men landed near Utica. Carthage attempted to negotiate, but Roman demands became increasingly impossible to satisfy. The city was ordered first to surrender its weapons and then to abandon its homeland entirely and rebuild farther inland. The Carthaginians refused. The siege lasted nearly 3 years. In March 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus finally broke through the defenses and entered the city. What followed was 6 days and nights of street fighting. Buildings were burned, walls collapsed, and soldiers fought from house to house. Ancient accounts describe streets filled with rubble, bodies, and wounded civilians. Roman troops clearing paths through the ruins dragged aside the dead and dying alike, treating human bodies as part of the debris. The final resistance gathered on the Byrsa, the fortified hill at the center of the city. Once it fell, approximately 50,000 survivors were enslaved. Carthage was plundered and burned, with fires continuing for days. Archaeology confirms that these accounts were not simply literary exaggerations. Excavators have uncovered widespread layers of ash, scorched floors, collapsed houses, human bones buried beneath fallen walls, and large mass graves containing hundreds of skeletons. The famous claim that Rome sowed the ruins with salt is a later invention. Yet the destruction itself was very real. In 146 BCE, Rome eliminated 2 of the Mediterranean's most important cities almost simultaneously. Corinth represented the commercial and strategic heart of Greece, while Carthage remained Rome's greatest historic rival in the West. Their destruction sent a message that could not be misunderstood. Rome was no longer merely defeating opposing states. It was demonstrating that any city regarded as a serious political or strategic threat could be erased completely. The destruction of Carthage and Corinth in 146 BCE was already viewed in antiquity as the moment when Rome became the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Yet this supremacy did not emerge from a single conquest or a carefully designed plan. It was the result of decades of warfare, trade, exploitation, diplomacy, and political instability unfolding differently across each region. In North Africa, Rome immediately created the province of Africa, with Utica as its capital. The fertile lands of northern Tunisia, especially their valuable grain-producing areas, now came under direct Roman administration. Carthage, Rome's oldest and most feared rival, had been physically destroyed and permanently removed as an independent power. Conditions in Iberia remained very different. Since the end of the Second Punic War, Rome had fought almost continuously to extend Hispania, Citeria, and Hispania Ulteria. Indigenous settlements were attacked, destroyed, or forced into unequal treaties, while Roman commanders returned to Italy with silver, gold, slaves, and other spoils. New cities were established according to Roman models, and Italian merchants and public contractors exploited the peninsula's mines on an enormous scale. In southern Gaul, economic influence came before permanent conquest. Italian wine, pottery, and other products traveled through Massalia and along the Rhone Valley into the interior, reaching even western and northern Gaul. These commercial networks were already well established before Roman armies began intervening regularly against Ligurian and Gallic peoples. By 146 BCE, southern Gaul had not yet become a Roman province, but warfare, enslavement, and economic dependence were already transforming the region. A similar process unfolded across the Adriatic. Roman campaigns had turned the Illyrian coast into a sphere of influence, while merchants based around Apollonia, Dyrrhachium, and the Ionian Islands reshaped local economies. After the failure of the four client states created in Macedon following the Battle of Pydna, Rome imposed direct provincial control over Macedon and parts of Greece. The construction of the Via Egnatia began around the same period, linking the Adriatic coast with Macedonia and Thessalonica. Despite the importance of this road, maritime transport remained the main connection between Italy and the Greek East. The free port of Delos provided Rome with an independent commercial station between Macedon and the Adriatic, while weakening older trading powers such as Rhodes and Corinth. The events of 146 BCE therefore caused a major reorganization of Mediterranean trade. With Carthage and Corinth destroyed, Italy and Roman-controlled Sicily stood increasingly at the economic center of the region. Yet this transformation had begun decades earlier. After the Second Punic War, Italian merchants had expanded rapidly into Iberia, Gaul, Greece, and the Aegean. Trade between central Italy and the western provinces stimulated wine and pottery production in Latium and Campania. In the eastern Mediterranean, Delos linked Italy with Macedon and the northern Aegean. Wine, oil, ceramics, and silver moved eastward, while raw materials and enslaved people were transported toward Italy. Delos became even more important after the death of Attalus III of Pergamon in 133 BCE. Having no heir, the king left his realm to Rome. After resistance was suppressed, the territory became the province of Asia in 129 BCE, extending Roman rule into western Anatolia. Only then did Delos fully develop into one of the greatest commercial centers of the late Hellenistic world. Rome's rise cannot therefore be explained simply as territorial expansion. It involved military force, economic dependence, political alliances, cultural change, and the transformation of daily life. These developments varied greatly from one place to another and did not follow a single timetable. Nor is there convincing evidence that the Senate followed a coherent plan for world conquest. Roman decisions often responded to local crises, rivalries, appeals from allies, ambitions of commanders, and opportunities for profit. What appeared later as a unified empire emerged from many separate and often unpredictable developments. The frontier regions were especially unstable. Roman commanders sought triumphs and military glory, while merchants and contractors pursued wealth. Their interests collided with the established political systems and social traditions of indigenous communities. Describing this merely as cultural contact would hide the violence at the heart of the process. In Iberia and southern Gaul, settlements were burned, populations massacred, and survivors deported or enslaved. Communities that escaped complete destruction still faced heavy tribute, new agricultural demands, and growing dependence on Roman authorities. Local elites were forced to cooperate with provincial governors while trying to preserve their position among their own people. Roman goods also changed existing patterns of consumption. Italian wine, oil, pottery, and coinage introduced new habits and new symbols of status. Settlement patterns were reorganized to increase production, while older political and social structures gradually weakened. For this reason, the transformation of the Mediterranean should not be reduced to a simple story of Romanization. Local identities did not disappear immediately, and Roman culture did not spread in a uniform manner. Different communities adopted, rejected, or reshaped Roman practices according to their own circumstances. What united the regions entering Rome's sphere of power were three recurring experiences: sustained violence, prolonged political instability, and profound changes in everyday life. The conquered territories also gave Rome access to immense resources. Gold, silver, iron, timber, grain, and enslaved labor could now be extracted on a permanent basis. These resources strengthened the Roman state, enriched its elites, and supported further expansion. The denarius, introduced during the Second Punic War, became increasingly important in this new economic system. Roman silver coinage spread from Hispania to the Greek East through soldiers, merchants, and state contractors. In Italy itself, this flow of money encouraged urban development and rising consumption, particularly during the later 2nd century BCE. Among the greatest beneficiaries were the publicani, private contractors who performed essential tasks for the Republic. They collected taxes and customs duties, supplied armies, managed mines and quarries, and organized major public projects. Many were wealthy members of the equestrian order with close connections to senatorial families. Their power expanded rapidly during and after the Second Punic War, when Rome increasingly relied on private companies for military supplies and state administration. As Roman territory grew, so did the opportunities for profit. Yet fraud, corruption, and embezzlement were already producing scandals by the end of the 3rd century BCE. Roman imperialism was therefore not only a political or military phenomenon, it was also visible in coins, roads, mines, ports, pottery, trade routes, settlement patterns, and the movement of millions of people. By the second half of the 2nd century BCE, the Mediterranean had become an interconnected world. Events in Italy and North Africa could no longer be separated from those in Greece, Asia Minor, or Iberia. As Polybius observed, the histories of these regions had begun to form a single story. That story was the rise of Rome. The growing unity of the Mediterranean world can be traced not only through ancient texts, but also through roads, temples, pottery, coins, and the smallest objects of daily life. Yet this new interconnected world was not created through peaceful cultural exchange. It emerged from warfare, forced migration, economic exploitation, and the ambitions of Roman elites. Rome's victories created a deeply unequal system. Some regions were incorporated into prosperous trade networks, while others were deliberately kept unstable and dependent. This system required the constant movement of enormous numbers of people, many of them against their will. The most dramatic examples were the mass enslavements that followed major Roman victories. Around 150,000 people were reportedly taken from Epirus after the Third Macedonian War, while approximately 50,000 Carthaginian survivors were sold after the destruction of their city. Entire populations were also deported from northern Italy. These spectacular events, however, represented only the most visible part of a much larger system. A continuous slave trade operated through southern Gaul, Illyria, the northern Macedonian frontier, and the eastern Mediterranean. Italian wine, oil, pottery, textiles, and silver coins were exchanged for human beings captured or purchased in peripheral regions. By the later 2nd century BCE, Rome and central Italy may have required between 50,000 and 70,000 new slaves every year. Warfare alone could not provide such a constant supply. Roman agriculture, mining, construction, domestic service, and elite lifestyles therefore depended on the continued existence of territories from which enslaved labor could be extracted. Conquest had given Rome increasing power to create and control markets. Yet Roman expansion cannot be explained by economics alone. The motivations of the individuals involved varied greatly, and political ambition, personal enrichment, military security, and social prestige were often closely connected. For many years, historians explained Roman expansion through the theory of defensive imperialism. According to this interpretation, Rome conquered new territories because it constantly feared external enemies. Military intervention was presented as a necessary response to threats, while economic motives were treated as relatively unimportant. This view was later challenged by scholars who emphasized the aggressive ambitions of the Roman ruling class. Senators and commanders could gain extraordinary wealth, reputation, and political influence through successful wars. From this perspective, the desire for glory and profit repeatedly pushed Rome toward further conquest. Frontier regions created especially dangerous opportunities. In Iberia, northern Italy, southern Gaul, and Illyria, Roman commanders often exercised enormous authority far from close senatorial supervision. These unstable borderlands became testing grounds where military leaders could pursue personal ambitions through raids, punitive campaigns, enslavement, and territorial expansion. Neither the purely defensive nor the purely aggressive interpretation, however, fully explains Roman imperialism. Rome did not follow the same policy everywhere. In Iberia and northern Italy, warfare, occupation, and territorial expansion became almost continuous. In southern Gaul and the eastern Mediterranean, direct military intervention alternated with diplomacy, alliances, trade, and indirect political control. There is little evidence that the Senate possessed a single, long-term plan to conquer the Mediterranean. Roman decisions usually emerged from immediate crises, regional rivalries, requests from allies, and competition among senators. Rome also operated within an international system in which violence was already common. Carthage, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and other Mediterranean powers all pursued their own security and expansion through war. The conflicts that drew Rome eastward were intensified by the collapse of Ptolemaic authority and the struggle to fill the resulting power vacuum. Roman policy in northern Italy developed under the pressure of the Hannibalic War, while the initial occupation of Iberia was largely improvised. Rome's military position after defeating Carthage was not yet strong enough to support a carefully planned conquest of the entire peninsula. These policies changed over time. As Roman power increased, temporary military occupation became permanent domination. In Hispania, the early effort to secure former Carthaginian territory gradually developed into a brutal program of territorial expansion, economic exploitation, and pacification through overwhelming force. The actions of individual senators help explain why Roman strategy often appeared inconsistent. Commanders sought wealth and military glory, but they belonged to aristocratic families competing fiercely for influence within Rome. A victorious general could return with treasure, captives, and the prestige of a triumph. These achievements could determine elections and elevate an entire family. Nevertheless, commanders did not act with complete freedom. The Senate remained the central authority in decisions concerning war, diplomacy, provincial commands, and peace settlements. Even the most celebrated generals were expected to answer for their actions. Scipio Africanus once dramatically destroyed financial records connected to the war against Antiochus III and demanded that the Senate remember his victories rather than question his family's accounts. Yet, such displays of confidence did not mean that senatorial control had disappeared. Until the early 1st century BCE, Rome's political institutions generally retained authority over military commanders. Roman foreign policy was also influenced by ideals that cannot be dismissed as mere propaganda. One of the most important was fides, the obligation to remain loyal to allies and agreements. Rome frequently used the defense of an ally as a justification for intervention, and such claims could certainly conceal political ambitions. Yet loyalty was also a genuine element of aristocratic morality and Roman political identity. Similarly, Roman leaders continued to insist that wars required a legitimate cause. Formal declarations, diplomatic demands, alleged treaty violations, and appeals from allied states gave military action a moral and legal framework. The Romans did not initially imagine their empire simply as the permanent occupation of foreign territory. They understood it primarily as the exercise of authority over other communities. This authority could take many forms. It might involve direct conquest, provincial administration, treaties, military intimidation, economic dependence, or control through loyal local elites. Roman power therefore constantly moved between physical violence and claims of moral superiority. This helps explain why Rome could dominate a kingdom without annexing it, destroy one city while protecting another, or withdraw its army while leaving behind a political system dependent on Roman approval. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, this network of direct and indirect control stretched across almost the entire Mediterranean. Rome did not govern every region in the same way, but few rulers could ignore the wishes of the Senate. Cicero later captured this reality when he described the influence of the senator Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. According to him, almost the entire world could be ruled by a simple nod of the man's head. The statement was exaggerated, but the world it described was real. Rome's supremacy rested not only on conquered territory, but on its ability to command armies, control markets, reward allies, punish enemies, and shape political decisions far beyond Italy. Despite Rome's vast expansion across the Mediterranean, the true center of its power remained Italy. For centuries, Rome had built a strong alliance system across the peninsula, giving it access to an enormous pool of soldiers that formed the foundation of its military dominance. At the same time, conquered land became public property, allowing Rome to establish colonies that secured newly acquired territories. During the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, these colonies served two main purposes. In northern Italy, they protected Rome's frontier against Celtic tribes occupying the Po Valley. Along the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic coasts, they strengthened Roman control over strategic ports and maritime trade. Some colonies soon became major commercial centers. Puteoli, founded in 194 BCE, possessed one of the finest harbors in Italy and rapidly developed into one of the Mediterranean's busiest ports. Aquileia, established in 181 BCE near the northern Adriatic, was originally intended to block Celtic settlement, but its strategic position quickly transformed it into a gateway for trade with the Balkans and a base for further Roman expansion into northeastern Europe. Economic growth, however, did not bring peace. Recent archaeological discoveries reveal that the regions surrounding Aquileia remained active military frontiers throughout the 2nd century BCE. Roman armies continued campaigning along the northeastern Adriatic as they secured control over the surrounding countryside. Northern Italy itself was far from pacified. After founding the colony of Ariminum in 268 BCE, Rome fought decades of warfare against Celtic tribes inhabiting the Po Valley. Major campaigns culminated in the capture of Mediolanum, modern Milan, while new colonies such as Placentia and Cremona secured Roman control of the region before Hannibal invaded Italy. Following the Second Punic War, Roman armies returned repeatedly to northern Italy until the Boii and other Celtic peoples were finally subdued. Conquest was followed by permanent settlement. Surveyors divided the newly occupied land into regular plots, thousands of Roman settlers arrived, and an expanding network of roads and towns permanently altered the landscape. Archaeology shows that cultural exchange soon followed. Burial customs, weapons, pottery, clothing, and household objects reveal a gradual blending of Roman and Celtic traditions, while many local practices continued to survive. Yet this cultural interaction unfolded within a landscape shaped by constant violence. Unlike the Eastern Mediterranean, where Rome often relied on indirect influence, northern Italy was intended to become permanently Roman. Expansion therefore depended not only on major battles, but also on repeated raids, punitive expeditions, forced migrations, and the destruction of hostile communities. The same pattern appeared in neighboring Liguria. Between 197 and 154 BCE, Roman commanders launched almost continuous campaigns against Ligurian tribes. Existing settlements were conquered, new colonies such as Lucca and Luni were founded, and Roman generals celebrated numerous triumphs for their victories. These wars rarely consisted of single decisive battles. Instead, they involved a long struggle over territory. Roads, forts, and colonies steadily expanded Roman control, while looting, enslavement, and mass deportations became regular instruments of policy. One of the largest forced migrations occurred in 180 BCE, when roughly 47,000 Ligurians were removed from their homeland and resettled hundreds of kilometers away in southern Italy. Similar deportations followed in later decades. Even so, complete cultural assimilation did not occur immediately. Outside the newly established Roman colonies, many indigenous elites retained their local authority. Celtic traditions remained visible in pottery, burial customs, and everyday life, while Roman imports initially appeared only as rare prestige objects. Only toward the beginning of the 1st century BCE did Roman cultural influence begin spreading more widely across the region. Northern Italy therefore became one of Rome's earliest laboratories of permanent expansion. Together with Hispania, it witnessed decades of continuous warfare, settlement, colonization, forced displacement, and economic transformation. Generations of Roman commanders gained military experience in these frontier conflicts, where policies of intimidation and territorial control became increasingly common. These developments ultimately bring the story back to Italy itself. Understanding Rome's campaigns in Iberia, North Africa, Greece, and the Balkans helps explain an event much closer to the heart of the Republic: the destruction of the Latin colony of Fregellae in 125 BCE. Roman writers later mentioned the fall of Fregellae alongside the destruction of Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia. Such comparisons reveal how deeply the event shocked Roman society. Unlike those foreign enemies, Fregellae had long been one of Rome's own loyal allies. Its destruction demonstrated that the methods Rome had developed on distant frontiers could also be turned against communities within Italy itself. By the late 2nd century BCE, the violence that had built Rome's Mediterranean empire was no longer confined to foreign lands. It had begun returning to the peninsula that had made Roman expansion possible, foreshadowing the internal conflicts and civil wars that would soon transform the Republic forever. The destruction of Fregellae in 125 BCE was far more than a minor local revolt. It exposed tensions that had been growing inside Italy for generations and foreshadowed the political violence of the late Republic. Rome's victories across the Mediterranean had transformed both Roman society and the allied communities of Italy. War brought wealth, land, slaves, military prestige, and new commercial opportunities. Roman senators benefited enormously, but so did many officers and leading families from allied Italian cities. These elites became increasingly connected through military service, trade, marriage, friendship, and political patronage. Yet the alliance remained deeply unequal. Rome depended on Italian communities for soldiers, but it continued to reserve the greatest legal and political advantages for its own citizens. This contradiction lay at the heart of the Fregellan crisis. In 125 BCE, the consul Marcus Fulvius Flaccus proposed granting full Roman citizenship to the Latin allies. The Roman Popular Assembly rejected the measure. Roman citizenship had become an extremely valuable privilege. It provided voting rights, access to political office, legal protection, tax advantages, and greater opportunities to profit from Rome's growing empire. Since 167 BCE, Roman citizens had also been exempt from direct wartime taxation because foreign conquests had filled the treasury with enormous wealth. The Italian allies shared the burdens of expansion without enjoying equal rights. Most allied communities had originally entered Rome's network after military defeat. Their treaties required them to provide troops whenever Rome went to war. Although allied soldiers received a share of military booty, their communities had little influence over the policies that determined where, when, and why those wars were fought. Fregellae occupied an important place within this system. It was a Latin colony with its own institutions and local government. Its inhabitants possessed many legal rights associated with Roman citizenship, but they could not vote in Roman assemblies or participate fully in Roman political life. For the leading families of Fregellae, influence in Rome therefore depended on personal relationships with powerful senatorial families. By the late 3rd century BCE, these connections had become increasingly close as Fregellan elites served in Roman armies and benefited from Mediterranean conquest. Yet cooperation created new expectations. The allies had helped Rome defeat Carthage, conquer Macedon, expand in Iberia, and dominate the Mediterranean. Their soldiers fought beside Roman citizens, and their elites shared in the dangers and profits of war. Nevertheless, they remained excluded from the political system governing this expansion. The growing wealth of the 2nd century BCE made this inequality even more visible. Profits from conquest were distributed unevenly, not only between Romans and Italians, but also among competing families within each community. Political rivalry intensified, while public debates about luxury, wealth, land, and moral decline became increasingly bitter. The refusal of citizenship in 125 BCE therefore struck directly at the ambitions of the allied elites. The leaders of the Fregellan revolt appear to have come from the very families most deeply connected to Roman politics and most disappointed by the rejection of Flaccus's proposal. They had prospered within Rome's imperial system, but were denied equal access to the institutions that controlled it. Roman politicians defended this exclusion openly. A few years later, opponents of another citizenship proposal warned Roman citizens that Italians would take their places at assemblies, festivals, and public distributions. The argument revealed the fear that extending citizenship would force Romans to share their political and material privileges. The revolt of Fregellae emerged from this fundamental imbalance. Rome and its allies had created an empire together, but they had not shared its rewards equally. Military cooperation and economic integration had advanced much faster than political inclusion. When reform failed, frustration turned suddenly into rebellion. The destruction of Fregellae brought war back to central Italy after more than 70 years of relative peace. It demonstrated that the violence Rome had used across the Mediterranean could now erupt within the alliance system on which its power depended. The crisis of 125 BCE was therefore an early warning. Unless Rome resolved the question of Italian citizenship, the struggle between citizens and allies would eventually threaten the survival of the Republic itself. The ancient sources provide only scattered information about the siege of Fregellae. Nevertheless, the city's landscape, military traditions, and recent archaeological discoveries allow the events of 125 BCE to be reconstructed more clearly. Fregellae stood on elevated ground above the river Liris. Rivers and sloping terrain protected its western, eastern, and southern sides, making a direct assault practical mainly from the north. A massive barrier wall may also have blocked the Via Latina before it reached the city. The Roman commander Lucius Opimius probably approached along this road before crossing the Liris near modern Ceprano. To isolate Fregellae, his forces had to control the surrounding roads and riverbanks, preventing supplies or reinforcements from reaching the defenders. The city was not an easy target. Its inhabitants had a long history of military service in Rome's wars, and Fregellan cavalry had repeatedly distinguished itself in campaigns across the Mediterranean. Many commanders came from the city's leading families and understood Roman tactics from personal experience. Archaeological evidence reflects the importance of warfare to this elite. In one wealthy house near the Forum, fragments of a decorative terracotta frieze depict ships, soldiers, and elephants. The images may represent the Roman victories over Antiochus III at Myonessus and Magnesia in 190 BCE. Displayed prominently in the house's reception area, these scenes celebrated the family's connection to Rome's eastern campaigns. They reveal that the Fregellan aristocracy took great pride in helping build Roman power. The same men who later resisted Rome had once fought beside its armies. Opimius therefore faced fortified terrain and defenders familiar with Roman warfare. Later traditions suggest that the fighting was intense, and Opimius himself reportedly boasted before the Senate about the scale of his achievement. Recent archaeology, however, indicates that he may not have relied primarily on direct assault. Since 2018, surveys, aerial photography, laser scanning, and geophysical research have identified what appear to be several Roman siege installations north of the city. These included two smaller forts and a larger camp positioned to block the Via Sorana, Fregellae's principal route to the north. Additional sites created a chain of visual communication around the city. Yet the camp stood too far away for Roman artillery to bombard the walls effectively. Their purpose was therefore probably to surround Fregellae rather than storm it. The strategy closely resembled the siege of Numantia 8 years earlier. Roman troops cut the city off from the outside world while devastating its agricultural territory. Excavations of a wealthy rural villa, destroyed during the 120s BCE, suggest that farms and estates around Fregellae were deliberately attacked. By destroying food supplies and isolating the population, Opimius intended to force surrender through hunger. The final collapse appears to have involved betrayal, although the surviving evidence provides few details. What is clear is that later Roman tradition remembered Fregellae not as a defeated ally with legitimate grievances, but as a symbol of treachery. Only about 40 years later, Cicero used the question, "Are the Fregellans friends of the Roman people?" as an example of obvious rhetorical irony. To his audience, the answer required no explanation. Fregellae had become a warning against disloyalty. Its rebellion was stripped of political context and transformed into a moral lesson about betrayal. In this way, Rome justified the destruction of a former ally while concealing the deeper inequalities that had driven the city to revolt. Fregellae was ultimately destroyed not only by Roman force, but also by betrayal from within. Quintus Numitorius Pullus had apparently been one of the leading figures in the revolt. Yet after the city fell, he was acquitted by the Roman military court because he had later provided Opimius with a decisive service. Other references make the nature of that service clear. Numitorius betrayed Fregellae and enabled the Romans to enter the city. His actions revealed that the siege had failed to produce a quick Roman victory. Opimius had neither stormed the fortifications nor completely starved the defenders into submission. Instead, divisions developed among the Fregellan elite until one of its own leaders abandoned the rebellion and delivered the city to Rome. After the betrayal, Fregellae surrendered. What followed was not a spontaneous act of looting, but a systematic destruction ordered by the Roman command. Ancient writers used unusually severe language to describe its fate. They claimed that Opimius demolished, annihilated, or completely overthrew the city, leaving almost nothing of its foundations. Archaeological excavations strongly support these accounts. Residential districts, baths, public buildings, and properties beyond the city were deliberately destroyed and never rebuilt. Centuries later, an imperial villa and its cemetery occupied land that had once contained wealthy townhouses. Their occupants apparently had no knowledge that a city had existed beneath them. The former urban landscape had been transformed into fields and pasture. Evidence from the political center of Fregellae suggests that its destruction was accompanied by an official Roman ritual. Above the remains of the town hall, archaeologists found a thick layer of ash, animal bones, black glazed drinking cups, and cooking vessels. The remains do not resemble ordinary domestic waste. They point instead to a large public sacrifice. Animals were slaughtered and burned, wine was poured as an offering, and those present consumed part of the meat during a ritual meal. This ceremony may have been connected to the ancient rite known as devotio. In moments of extreme military danger, a Roman commander could formally dedicate an enemy city, its territory, and its people to the gods of the underworld. Before this curse was pronounced, the protective gods of the city could first be summoned to abandon it through another ritual called evocatio. Macrobius later included Fregellae among cities associated with this practice. If the ritual was performed in 125 BCE, Opimius himself would have spoken the sacred formula as commander. The purpose was not merely to request victory. The entire enemy community was symbolically condemned. Its inhabitants, soldiers, land, buildings, and future were handed over to the underworld in exchange for the safety of the Roman army. The destruction of Fregellae was therefore both military and religious. Rome did not simply defeat a rebellious colony. It declared the city disloyal, removed its divine protection, destroyed its buildings, dispersed its population, and erased its urban existence. The same rituals and methods used against foreign enemies such as Carthage had now been directed against an old Italian ally only a short distance from Rome. The ritual performed after the fall of Fregellae completed a sacred bargain between Rome and the gods. Before the siege, Opimius had symbolically dedicated the city and its inhabitants to the gods of the underworld in exchange for victory. Once Fregellae fell, he was expected to fulfill that vow. The archaeological evidence suggests that this obligation was taken seriously. Above the ruins of the city's council house, Roman soldiers carried out a large public sacrifice involving ritual drinking, animal offerings, and a communal feast. The ceremony took place in the very heart of Fregellae's political life, transforming the city's former center of civic pride into a stage for celebrating its destruction. For modern readers, such events may appear to reflect only the brutality or religious beliefs of an ancient society. Yet the destruction of Fregellae represented something far more significant. It revealed the deeper political tensions that were beginning to tear apart the Roman Republic. The city's fall was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of profound changes taking place across Italy. Economic inequality, disputes over citizenship, growing competition. Among elites and the increasing use of violence in politics were all becoming defining features of the late 2nd century BCE. Only 4 years later, Lucius Opimius would again become infamous when he ordered the mass execution of supporters of Gaius Gracchus. The destruction of Fregellae therefore marked an early stage in the brutal political culture that would eventually lead to the Roman civil wars. Rome had certainly punished rebellious allies before. In 265 BCE, the Etruscan city of Volsini was besieged after internal unrest. Once captured, its leaders were executed, the old city was destroyed, and the surviving population was relocated to a newly founded settlement. A similar fate awaited Falerii in 241 BCE. Thousands of inhabitants died during the siege, much of the territory was confiscated, the original city was demolished, and the survivors were transferred to a new location. Capua experienced comparable punishment after supporting Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Its leaders were executed, many inhabitants were enslaved, others were deported, and the city lost its political independence. These examples demonstrate that Rome had long responded harshly to rebellion. Victorious commanders often celebrated triumphs after suppressing such revolts, seeing them as major military achievements. Fregellae, however, introduced a new dimension. Although Opimius sought a triumph, the Senate refused because no new territory had been added to Roman control. Even so, ancient writers quickly began comparing the destruction of Fregellae with the famous falls of Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia. The comparison was deliberate. Each of those cities represented a different purpose behind Roman destruction. Carthage was erased to eliminate Rome's greatest historic rival forever. Numantia was annihilated to crush stubborn resistance and discourage future rebellion in Hispania. Corinth was destroyed as a political warning to the Greek world, demonstrating the consequences of opposing Roman authority after the Macedonian Wars. Fregellae shared elements of all three. Like Numantia, it served as a warning against revolt. Like Corinth, its destruction sent a message to other allied communities. And like Carthage, its fall was accompanied by rituals and actions intended to erase not only the city itself, but its political identity. These comparisons highlight three recurring features of Roman rule during the late 2nd century BCE. First came annihilation. Rebellious communities could be physically destroyed, their buildings demolished, and their political institutions eliminated. Second came dispersal. Populations were enslaved, deported, or relocated, making organized resistance far more difficult. Third came religious legitimization. Rituals such as devotio presented destruction not merely as military necessity, but as an act sanctioned by the gods themselves. The fall of Fregellae therefore illustrates how Roman power combined military force, political calculation, and religious belief into a single strategy of domination. By the late 2nd century BCE, the methods Rome had perfected against foreign enemies were no longer reserved for Carthage, Corinth, or Numantia. They could now be employed against Italy's own allies, revealing how the violence that had created the Roman Empire was beginning to turn inward against the Republic itself. The destruction of Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia followed different purposes. Numantia was almost completely erased as a rebellious community, while the cultural treasures of Carthage and Corinth were deliberately preserved, removed, and redistributed. After the fall of Corinth, the Roman commander Lucius Mummius collected statues, paintings, and valuable objects and sent them to cities across Greece and Italy. These spoils appeared in places such as Olympia, Thebes, Pompeii, Parma, and even Fregellae. In Pompeii, a captured Greek statue was installed in the sanctuary of Apollo with an inscription written in the local Oscan language. These gifts were more than simple displays of conquest. Mummius gained prestige as the victorious donor, while the communities receiving the objects gained honor and valuable works of art. Through this ritual exchange, the material culture of defeated cities was dispersed across the Roman world. The destruction of Corinth, therefore, did not aim to erase its cultural memory completely. Instead, its monuments and artworks became permanent reminders of Roman victory. Carthage and Corinth continued to exist symbolically through the objects taken from them. By contrast, Numantia represented a model of total punishment directed against rebellion. Its destruction was intended to eliminate resistance and intimidate other communities. Fregellae belonged more closely to this second category. It was neither Rome's ancient rival like Carthage, nor a celebrated cultural center like Corinth. The conflict was deeply unequal, resembling Rome's wars against Numantia and the indigenous communities of Iberia and Liguria. In 125 BCE, Lucius Opimius transferred the methods developed on those violent frontiers into central Italy. The city was surrounded, isolated, betrayed, ritually condemned, and systematically demolished. This was not merely a return to older Roman punishments against rebellious allies. The more immediate models were the recent destructions of Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia, along with decades of massacres and deportations in Spain and northern Italy. Opimius himself embodied this tradition. His father, Quintus Opimius, had fought against Ligurian peoples in northern Italy and southern Gaul. These frontier regions allowed Roman commanders far greater freedom than the politically complex Eastern Mediterranean. Warfare there became increasingly aggressive, flexible, and profitable, involving raids, enslavement, territorial seizure, and forced migration. Lucius Opimius inherited not only this military background, but also a powerful religious tradition. After his military career, his father joined the Decemviri Sacris Faciundis, the priestly college responsible for consulting the Sibylline books and supervising important public rituals. During moments of crisis, these priests ordered sacrifices and ceremonies intended to restore Rome's relationship with the gods. Some of these rituals were deliberately ancient and extreme. During the Second Punic War, they organized mass sacrifices, the dedication of entire generations of animals, and even the burial alive of foreign men and women. By the 2nd century BCE, their religious authority extended across much of Italy. The Opimian family openly celebrated this priestly connection. A coin issued by Lucius's brother displayed the Delphic tripod of Apollo, symbolizing their father's sacred office. In the destruction of Fregellae, Lucius Opimius combined these two family traditions. From his father's military career came the methods of violent frontier warfare. From his religious office came an attachment to ancient rituals that could justify destruction as a sacred duty. The result was the deliberate annihilation of an Italian city through both military and religious means. This combination reflected a broader development in late Republican politics. From the middle of the 2nd century BCE, religious language and ritual were increasingly used to legitimize political violence. Actions against enemies and rebels could be presented, not merely as strategic necessities, but as obligations demanded by tradition and approved by the gods. The fall of Fregellae therefore reveals more than the cruelty of one commander. It shows how imperial warfare, aristocratic ambition, family memory, and religious authority were beginning to merge. The violence developed on Rome's distant frontiers had now reached central Italy, where it could be directed against Rome's own allies and eventually against Roman citizens themselves. The deaths of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus reveal how political violence and religious ritual became increasingly intertwined during the late 2nd century BCE. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus attempted to secure a second term as tribune of the plebs, violating established political custom. During the confrontation, the chief priest Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica publicly cursed him and effectively declared him an enemy who could be killed. Tiberius and many of his followers were then beaten to death in a sudden outbreak of violence. Their bodies were denied proper burial and thrown into the Tiber. Several supporters were later executed after politically motivated trials. These actions created deep religious anxiety because the killing of Roman citizens and the denial of burial threatened the sacred order of the community. At the same time, Rome faced other serious crises, including the slave revolt in Sicily, the war at Numantia, and the uprising of Aristonicus in Asia Minor. Many senators interpreted these disasters as signs of divine anger. The Sibylline books were consulted, and religious delegations were sent to perform sacrifices intended to restore peace between Rome and the gods. A similar pattern appeared in 121 BCE during the conflict with Gaius Gracchus. Gaius and his ally Marcus Fulvius Flaccus organized armed resistance on the Aventine Hill. Unlike Tiberius, they were no longer magistrates, but private citizens leading a mass political movement. Their occupation of an entire district produced something close to a siege within Rome itself. This time, Lucius Opimius acted with both religious and constitutional support. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree allowing the consul to take whatever measures he considered necessary to protect the state. Opimius used soldiers and mercenaries against Roman citizens inside the city. A reward was offered for Gaius's head, and after the resistance collapsed, special courts were established to punish his followers. More than 3,000 people were reportedly executed, while the property and families of the defeated leaders were also targeted. After the bloodshed, Opimius ordered a public purification ritual and built a temple to Concordia, the goddess of harmony. The message was deeply contradictory. The Roman citizenry had been reunited through the violent elimination of one of its political factions. These events did not represent a carefully planned new policy. Roman leaders reacted to crisis by drawing on familiar religious traditions, emergency powers, and earlier experiences of repression. Nasica relied on his priestly authority, while Opimius combined senatorial approval with rituals of purification. In both cases, the victorious faction believed that political order could be restored only after the religious pollution caused by violence had been removed. This pattern continued. In 114 BCE, when Rome feared invasion by the Cimbri and Teutones, 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls were buried alive in the Forum Boarium. Such an archaic human sacrifice demonstrated the extreme measures Roman authorities were willing to employ during moments of uncertainty. Religion was therefore increasingly used to justify and manage political violence. Yet these rituals were not merely propaganda. Roman religion did not separate sacred affairs from public life. War, law, politics, and divine approval formed parts of the same system. Reports of supernatural signs also played an important role. Lightning strikes, earthquakes, strange births, bleeding statues, and other prodigies were sent to Rome from allied communities and officially interpreted. Priests then performed sacrifices to neutralize the danger they supposedly announced. Shortly before the rebellion of Fregellae, a series of alarming omens was reported. Temples on the capital were struck during storms. Lightning caused destruction around Rome. Mount Etna erupted, and an underwater eruption near the Lipari Islands killed sailors and poisoned fish. Roman seers interpreted these events as warnings of rebellion. Against this background, the devotio performed by Opimius at Fregellae becomes more understandable. The ritual was intended not only to secure military victory, but also to restore harmony between the human and divine worlds. The destruction of Fregellae was therefore part of a wider transformation. From the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome treated defeated enemies with growing severity. Carthage, Corinth, Numantia, and Fregellae experienced different combinations of physical destruction, population dispersal, ritual condemnation, and the erasure of collective memory. The violence that had previously been directed against foreign communities was gradually transferred into Italy and eventually into Rome itself. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a decisive stage in this process. Political opponents were now treated through methods resembling those used against rebellious cities and foreign enemies. Emergency powers, religious curses, military force, executions, and public purification became tools of domestic politics. This development formed one of the foundations of the later Roman civil wars. Violence did not affect only armies and political institutions. It reshaped settlements, economic life, architecture, religious beliefs, social relations, and everyday behavior. Fear of destruction became part of the experience of entire communities. To understand the final century of the Roman Republic, civil war must therefore be seen not merely as a series of battles between generals. It was a much broader transformation in which the violence of Mediterranean conquest returned to the center of Roman society. To understand the violence of the late Roman Republic, it is necessary to look beyond individual battles and measure how warfare affected entire regions over generations. The period from 200 to 31 BCE reveals that Roman expansion created broad and repeated zones of destruction across the Mediterranean. This reconstruction combines written accounts of battles and sieges, archaeological evidence, and records of Roman triumphs. It also assumes that warfare affected far more than the exact locations where armies fought. Ancient forces consumed enormous quantities of food. A Roman infantryman required roughly 1 kilogram of grain each day, meaning that even an army of 5,000 needed at least 5 tons daily. During long campaigns, much of this supply had to be taken from surrounding communities. Military movements therefore brought requisitioning, looting, and severe disruption to rural life. Farms were abandoned, crops were destroyed, and civilian populations lost the resources on which their survival depended. War also destabilized the wider economy. Land was the principal security for loans, so confiscation or destruction could bankrupt both landowners and creditors. Even rumors of approaching armies could reduce property values, halt cultivation, and interrupt maritime trade. Campaigns also involved the deliberate destruction of mills, farms, vineyards, olive presses, and other agricultural infrastructure. Their effects continued long after the armies had departed, producing hunger, displacement, debt, and social conflict. For this reason, each documented battle or siege can be placed within a much wider zone of devastation. A radius of approximately 120 kilometers offers a conservative estimate of the territory from which armies could obtain supplies within several days of marching. In reality, repeated campaigns, winter warfare, poor harvests, difficult terrain, and conflicts without direct Roman participation would have expanded the affected areas considerably. The resulting picture reveals several regions in which organized violence became a recurring part of life. Iberia was one of the most heavily affected. Lusitania experienced almost continuous campaigns between the 180s and 130s BCE, while the Celtiberian territories of northern and eastern Spain witnessed repeated wars and sieges. Between 80 and 72 BCE, the Sertorian War again transformed the eastern coast and the Baetis Valley into major battlefields. Southern Gaul also suffered recurring invasions. Roman armies first became deeply involved there during the 2nd century BCE, and intensive campaigns followed in the Rhone Valley. The wars against the Cimbri and Teutones brought further destruction near the end of the century. Several decades later, Caesar's conquest of Gaul reached an even more devastating scale, with ancient figures claiming more than 1 million deaths and another 1 million people enslaved. Northern Italy was similarly exposed. The Po Valley experienced repeated warfare during the early 2nd century BCE, especially around Cremona, Placentia, and Mutina. It later became a battlefield again during the migrations of the Cimbri and Teutones. Liguria endured an especially long sequence of Roman campaigns. Numerous triumphs celebrated victories there, revealing the intensity and persistence of the fighting. Among the commanders involved was Quintus Opimius, father of the man who later destroyed Fregellae. North Africa suffered major devastation during the siege and destruction of Carthage. Only a few decades later, the Jugurthine War again exposed the region to raids by Roman and Numidian forces. Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands were also repeatedly attacked. Roman triumphs celebrated victories over their populations throughout the 2nd century BCE, demonstrating that these islands were not peaceful peripheral territories, but recurring zones of military repression. In the eastern Mediterranean, Roman conquest heavily affected Illyria, Dalmatia, Macedonia, Thrace, and central Greece. Thessaly and the region around the Lamian Gulf repeatedly served as gateways for Roman armies. River valleys in Macedonia and Thrace became military corridors through which troops, supplies, and destruction passed. Asia Minor and the Levant experienced less continuous Roman violence during this period, although individual events could be catastrophic. The massacre, known as the Ephesian Vespers, in which tens of thousands of Romans and Italians were reportedly killed, was one such exceptional episode. These areas had also endured generations of conflict among Hellenistic kingdoms and regional dynasties, before direct Roman intervention. The Mediterranean of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE was therefore not simply a world gradually unified by Roman rule. It was a landscape repeatedly transformed by armies, sieges, enslavement, confiscation, and economic collapse. In many regions, violence was not a temporary interruption, but a condition lasting for decades. Its effects shaped settlement patterns, agriculture, wealth, political loyalties, religious beliefs, and collective memory. The Roman civil wars emerged from this wider environment. The methods later used against Italian communities and Roman citizens had already been practiced for generations in Iberia, Liguria, Gaul, Greece, and North Africa. By the 1st century BCE, the violence of conquest had become deeply embedded in Roman political and military culture. Although Roman armies were less active in the eastern Mediterranean, between the wars against Antiochus III and Mithridates VI, the region remained deeply unstable. The decline of Seleucid power created prolonged political disorder, allowing warfare, raids, and slave trading to flourish. In Syria and Palestine, rival powers fought repeatedly for control. Samaritans and Maccabees clashed during the 2nd century BCE, while Antiochus IV invaded Jerusalem, reportedly enslaving tens of thousands of people. Later, dynastic struggles within the weakening Seleucid kingdom further intensified the instability, creating opportunities for Cilician pirates whose slave raids became a major feature of Eastern Mediterranean life. As a result, many communities in Asia Minor and the Levant lived under the constant threat of invasion, enslavement, displacement, and economic collapse, even when Roman armies were largely absent. When viewed over time, the geography of violence reveals striking regional differences. Some parts of the Mediterranean experienced only occasional wars, while others endured repeated destruction across several generations. Greece provides a clear example of this shifting pattern. Epirus, the Peloponnese, Central Greece, and Macedonia suffered heavily from Roman campaigns during the 2nd century BCE. After the destruction of Corinth and the defeat of Andriscus, however, these regions enjoyed roughly 50 years of relative peace. That stability ended abruptly during the First Mithridatic War. Sulla's campaigns devastated central Greece and Thrace, culminating in the sack of Athens in 86 BCE. Ancient writers attributed enormous casualties to these wars, while Pompey later claimed equally spectacular numbers for his eastern campaigns. Although such figures are undoubtedly exaggerated, they reflect the immense scale of warfare remembered by contemporaries. Peace proved short-lived. Beginning in 49 BCE, Greece once again became a battlefield during the civil wars between Caesar and Pompey, later between the Caesarians and Caesar's assassins, and finally during the struggle between Octavian and Antony. For nearly 20 years, many Greek cities endured repeated occupations, requisitions, taxation, and military destruction. Iberia experienced an even more continuous cycle of conflict. Early campaigns concentrated along the northeastern coast and the Baetis Valley before spreading into the Ebro Valley and the Celtiberian interior. Lusitania, the Baetis region, and Celtiberia remained active war zones for decades, exposing successive generations to almost uninterrupted violence. After only a brief period of recovery, warfare resumed around the turn of the 1st century BCE. The Sertorian War spread fighting into eastern Spain, while Pompey later boasted of conquering hundreds of Hispanic settlements. Only a few decades afterward, Caesar and Pompey again transformed many of the same regions into battlefields during the Roman civil wars. Other parts of the Mediterranean experienced much longer intervals of peace. Northern Italy, after intense campaigns in the early 2nd century BCE, remained relatively stable until the conflicts of Marius and Sulla and the revolt of Spartacus several generations later. North Africa likewise recovered after the Jugothine War, before becoming a major theater again during Caesar's campaigns. Asia Minor followed a similar rhythm. Apart from the First Mithridatic War, many regions escaped prolonged Roman warfare until the civil wars of the 1st century BCE. Even these quieter periods, however, should not be mistaken for complete peace. Frontier regions such as Hispania, Liguria, Illyria, Dalmatia, and Thrace continued to experience smaller campaigns, raids, piracy, and local conflicts between major wars. Taken together, these patterns reveal that violence in the Roman world was distributed unevenly across both space and time. Some societies experienced only isolated episodes of warfare, while others lived under the constant expectation of invasion, destruction, and displacement. Entire generations grew up knowing little but recurring conflict. This long-term geography of violence helps explain the transformation of the late Roman Republic. By the 1st century BCE, military destruction, forced migration, economic disruption, and political instability had become familiar realities across large parts of the Mediterranean. The Roman civil wars therefore emerged not in a peaceful empire, suddenly torn apart, but within a world that had already been shaped for generations by almost continuous warfare. War had shaped much of the Mediterranean for generations, yet Rome and central Italy remained largely untouched after the Second Punic War. For many Romans and Italian allies, organized violence was something inflicted on foreign enemies in Hispania, Greece, North Africa, and northern Italy. That changed with Fregellae and the conflicts of the Gracchian period. The methods developed in Rome's wars abroad were suddenly brought into the political and geographical heart of Italy. Violence was already deeply embedded in Roman society through slavery, family authority, and social hierarchy. Civil war, however, introduced something different. Organized armies began directing large-scale violence against Italian communities and Roman citizens. Ancient writers regarded the conflicts of the Gracchi, the Social War, Sulla, and the Second Triumvirate as unprecedented in both scale and brutality. The slave revolts in Sicily formed an early warning. Between the 130s and early 1st century BCE, rebel forces defeated Roman armies, captured cities, and forced the Senate to conduct costly sieges. The Second Servile War also encouraged unrest in Campania, where uprisings in Capua and Nuceria required military suppression. These conflicts overlapped with the killing of Tiberius Gracchus, the destruction of Fregellae, and Opimius's massacre of the supporters of Gaius Gracchus. By the late 2nd century BCE, outbreaks of internal violence were becoming increasingly frequent. The decisive turning point came with the Social War in 91 BCE. Rome's Italian allies rebelled after generations of military service without equal citizenship. They formed their own federation and established a new capital at Corfinium, which they renamed Italia. Rome responded by turning central and southern Italy into a vast battlefield. Fighting spread through Picenum, Campania, Samnium, Apulia, and the surrounding regions. Cities were repeatedly besieged, conquered, looted, and destroyed. Acernia endured several sieges. Hunger became so severe that its inhabitants were reportedly forced to eat dogs. Archerae was surrounded, Salernum captured, and the Roman garrison at Venafrum massacred. Pompeii, Bovianum, Compsa, and Eclanum were also attacked. The remains of Pompeii reveal how urgently cities prepared for war. Painted instructions divided the walls into defensive sectors controlled by members of the local elite. New towers were added, with platforms for artillery and openings for archers. These precautions were justified. Archaeologists have found evidence of catapult bombardment, sling projectiles, and damage to buildings near the Herculaneum Gate. The Social War was fought from the beginning with the full destructive power of contemporary siege warfare. Roman commanders brought similar devastation to Apulia. Salapia was destroyed, while Cannae, Larinum, Venusia, and Osculum were captured. Stabiae was demolished so completely that little remained of the settlement a century later. Asculum became one of the most bitterly contested cities of the war. The siege was also a local conflict in which neighboring Italian communities fought on opposite sides. Slingers from Firmum supported Rome against Asculum, while other Italian groups assisted the defenders. After the city fell, Pompeius Strabo allowed it to be plundered. Its leaders were executed, its possessions and captives sold, and the surviving inhabitants expelled without property. The experience of Marcus Aurelius illustrates the fate of many individuals. Although he belonged to a prominent Italian family, he was captured at Asculum, enslaved, forced to work on a Roman senator's estate, and eventually murdered. Other towns suffered similar destruction. Alba Fucens, Carseoli, Ocriculum, Grimentum, Nuceria, Pinna, and Picentia were among the communities attacked or devastated. In less than 3 years, the social war brought unprecedented violence, displacement, and ruin to much of Italy. Campania, the Bay of Naples, Samnium, the Tiber Valley, and Picenum were especially affected, while fighting continued in Apulia and Lucania until 87 BCE. The war had barely ended when the conflict between Marius and Sulla began. For the first time, Latium and the immediate surroundings of Rome became active war zones. Battles were fought around Ostia, Antium, Aricia, and Lanuvium, while Rome itself was besieged. Soldiers fought in the streets, and massacres took place within the city. Sulla's return from the east in 83 BCE produced an even more destructive phase. Armies moved through Latium, Campania, Etruria, Umbria, Picenum, and northern Italy. Battles took place near Canusium, Tinum, Capua, Praeneste, Clusium, Saturnia, Spoletium, Ariminum, Ravenna, and Placentia. Military movements along major roads caused widespread devastation in the surrounding countryside. The transformation was now complete. Within a single generation, the violence once associated with Rome's distant frontiers had spread across the Italian peninsula. Cities fortified themselves against Roman armies, neighboring communities attacked one another, civilians were enslaved, and Rome itself became a battlefield. The late Republican civil wars were therefore not a sudden collapse of an otherwise peaceful society. They were the result of military practices, political tensions, and habits of destruction that had developed during centuries of conquest and were now redirected against the communities that had created the Roman Empire. Sulla's return to Italy brought the conflict to a devastating climax. In only a few years, cities across Latium, Etruria, Umbria, Campania, and the Adriatic coast were captured or destroyed. Ariminum, Sena Gallica, Spoletium, Suessa Aurunca, Sulmo, Setia, Praeneste, and several Etruscan towns all fell. At Praeneste, Sulla's forces built a line of fortifications around the city and attempted to starve its defenders into submission. Elsewhere, the violence was even more extreme. Much of the population of Neapolis was reportedly massacred. At Norba, the inhabitants burned their own homes and killed one another rather than surrender. The city was abandoned for centuries, as was Populonia in Etruria. Ancient estimates claimed that the civil war and Sulla's reprisals killed more than 100,000 people. Many senators and Roman knights were also executed or forced into exile. Even after Sulla's main victory, resistance continued. Nola remained under siege until 80 BCE, while Volaterrae fell only the following year. Conflicts over the settlement of Sullan veterans caused further unrest, including a violent uprising at Faesulae. Sulla's death did not restore peace. The revolt of Lepidus again turned Etruria and the territory around Rome into a war zone. Soon afterward, Spartacus and a group of gladiators escaped from Capua and began a major slave rebellion. Their forces attacked several Campanian towns and operated around Mount Vesuvius before moving across Italy. The revolt ended with the defeat of Spartacus and the crucifixion of 6,000 captured slaves along the Via Appia. This brutal public display transformed the road into a monument to Roman punishment. Further instability followed. Catiline's supporters raised an army in Etruria, and street violence repeatedly disturbed Rome during the 50s BCE. When civil war began again in 49 BCE, Italy escaped widespread destruction only because Pompey withdrew his forces rather than defend the peninsula. The violence returned after Caesar's assassination. Rome descended into panic as Antony fortified his residence, and Caesar's assassins occupied the Capitoline Hill with armed gladiators. Looting, killings, and street clashes spread through the city. In northern Italy, Mutina was besieged and Parma sacked. A few years later, Octavian's war against Lucius Antonius and Fulvia devastated parts of Umbria and Etruria. Nursia and Veii were besieged, Sutrium captured, and Sentinum destroyed. The campaign ended at Perusia in 40 BCE. After the city surrendered, many members of its elite were killed. Archaeological excavations beneath the Cathedral of San Lorenzo have uncovered a thick destruction layer dating to this event, confirming that wealthy residences were burned across the urban center. The memory of the disaster survived for generations. The poet Propertius described Perusia as a landscape of tombs and unburied bones, a symbol of Italy's suffering during the civil wars. Taken as a whole, these events show that after 91 BCE, Rome and Italy became among the most unstable and violent regions of the Mediterranean. Over several generations, cities were repeatedly besieged, populations displaced, land confiscated, and political communities destroyed. This destruction took two closely connected forms. The first was the destruction of human life through massacre, starvation, enslavement, forced migration, and poverty. Such methods had long been used by Roman armies abroad. Communities in Epirus, Lusitania, Liguria, northern Italy, and Iberia had already experienced mass killing and resettlement. By the late Republic, however, these methods aimed at more than temporary punishment. They could eliminate entire populations, destroy agricultural systems, and replace local ways of life with new political and economic structures. Rome generally followed a double strategy. Cooperative local elites were rewarded and incorporated, while resistant communities faced destruction. Fregellae marked the transfer of this approach into central Italy. The same model then reappeared throughout the social war and the later civil conflicts. Praeneste offers one of the clearest examples of its long-term consequences. The city had remained loyal to Rome during the social war, but later supported the Marian faction. After Sulla returned from the east, the younger Marius and his followers took refuge there. When Praeneste finally fell, almost its entire adult male population was reportedly massacred. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence supports the ancient accounts. Of the 138 families known from the city's Republican cemetery before 82 BCE, only about 20 can be identified afterward. The killings were followed by massive land confiscation and the settlement of sullen veterans. Within a few decades, most political offices in the new colony were held by newcomers rather than members of the old Praenestine elite. Of 92 known magistrates, only a small minority can be securely connected to the city's former leading families. The massacre had therefore produced not merely a change of government, but the replacement of an entire ruling class. Burial customs reveal the same transformation. Earlier, graves had been relatively uniform, even among wealthy families. After Sulla's conquest, many old names disappeared, while a small number of larger and more imposing monuments began to dominate the cemetery. This reflected a new social order created through death, confiscation, and colonization. Within days, much of the old community of Praeneste had been destroyed. In the years that followed, its land, institutions, and social hierarchy were rebuilt around Sulla's veterans and supporters. Between 91 and 40 BCE, similar transformations occurred repeatedly across Italy. The fate of Fregellae was no longer exceptional. It had become a model for the violent destruction and reconstruction of communities during the age of Roman civil war. A second form of destruction targeted not only human lives, but also buildings, monuments, sacred spaces, and collective memory. After a city was captured, Roman armies often carried out what ancient writers called a direptio, a violent sack intended to tear the defeated community apart. It usually began with indiscriminate killing, rape, and the seizure of prisoners. This was followed by organized looting and, in some cases, the deliberate destruction of temples, houses, archives, statues, and public spaces. For many Mediterranean communities, this brutal encounter was their first direct experience of Roman power. The destruction of Carthage, Corinth, Numantia, and Fregellae shows that Roman warfare could extend beyond defeating an enemy army. The physical symbols through which a community remembered its gods, ancestors, victories, and political identity could also be erased or removed. Plunder was therefore not an accidental consequence of conquest. It was deeply rooted in Roman military and political culture. A victorious commander hoped to be granted a triumph, the highest public honor available to a Roman general. During this procession, prisoners, captured weapons, paintings of battles, precious metals, statues, and luxury goods were displayed before the population of Rome. These objects were not presented simply because they were valuable. They served as visible proof that the general had defeated a foreign people and transferred its power to Rome. The desire for an impressive triumph encouraged commanders to treat entire cities as sources of potential booty. The conquest of Syracuse in 212 BCE is often described as a turning point because Marcus Claudius Marcellus brought large quantities of Greek art to Rome. Yet the practice was much older. Roman commanders had displayed statues, paintings, gold, and other treasures in triumphs for generations. What changed during the 2nd century BCE was the scale. After defeating Philip V, Flaminius paraded bronze and marble statues, silver vessels, and other treasures through Rome. Victories over Antiochus III and the Galatians brought decorated furniture, costly fabrics, silverware, and captured craftsmen. Marcus Fulvius Nobilior returned from Ambracia with hundreds of bronze and marble statues and numerous paintings. A generation later, the triumph of Lucius Aemilius Paulus lasted 3 days and displayed vast quantities of gold, silver, ivory, weapons, textiles, statues, and paintings taken from Macedonia. The year 146 BCE surpassed all previous examples. The spoils of Carthage, Corinth, and Macedonia were displayed in separate triumphs. Famous statues, sacred objects, precious metals, and artworks taken from defeated. Cities filled the processions. Some objects were later returned to former owners, while others were distributed throughout Rome, Italy, and the wider Mediterranean. These displays are often interpreted as evidence of Greek cultural influence on Rome. Yet in the triumph itself, a statue had the same fundamental meaning as a prisoner, a captured weapon, or a pile of silver. All were symbols of Roman victory. The growing quantities and increasingly spectacular forms of booty repeatedly demonstrated the military, moral, and religious superiority Rome claimed for itself. Religion played a central role in this process. Captured statues of gods could be removed from defeated cities and brought to Rome, symbolically transferring divine protection from the enemy to the victor. Roman priests carefully distinguished sacred objects from ordinary works of art so that each could be placed in an appropriate setting. After major conquests, priestly colleges sometimes inspected the captured material. Generals then dedicated much of the booty in temples or used its value to finance new religious buildings. Through these acts, conquest was transformed into a sacred exchange. The gods had granted Rome victory, and Rome returned part of the captured wealth through sacrifice and dedication. The distribution of spoils also had a social and political function. War booty was understood as belonging not simply to the victorious commander, but to the Roman Republic and its people. For this reason, its division was supposed to remain visible and controlled. Captives and objects appeared in an ordered, triumphal procession before being placed in public buildings, temples, forums, and allied cities. Private possession of captured artworks was initially viewed with suspicion. The proper destination of booty was the public sphere, where it could permanently commemorate the achievements of Rome and its allies. The triumph therefore transformed warfare into a carefully staged historical narrative. The Roman public did not merely hear that a distant city had been conquered. They saw its leaders in chains, its gods removed from their sanctuaries, its wealth displayed in the streets, and its history rewritten through the eyes of the victors. Visibility was essential. An object shown in Rome was physical proof that it had been taken from another place. Its removal demonstrated that the defeated community no longer controlled its own wealth, identity, or memory. Rome could symbolically gather the conquered world into its own streets. For the defeated, the consequences were profound. Sanctuaries were stripped, civic buildings emptied, and statues of gods, heroes, rulers, and ancestors disappeared from public spaces. Empty bases remained where monuments had once stood. The destruction was therefore not only economic or architectural, it removed the visual language through which communities understood their past. Roman conquest did not merely seize territory, it dismantled local memory, transported selected fragments to Rome, and placed them within a new story in which the history of the defeated became evidence of Roman greatness. Roman destruction also targeted the physical and religious identity of conquered communities. Cult statues, temple sculptures, columns, roofs, and entire architectural elements were removed from their original settings and transferred elsewhere. Sulla, for example, took columns from the Olympieion in Athens and reused them in the temple of Capitoline Jupiter in Rome. Earlier, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus had stripped marble from the temple of Hera Lacinia in southern Italy to decorate a temple of his own. Such acts did more than damage buildings. Temples, monuments, and statues embodied the myths, ancestors, and sacred traditions of a city. By dismantling them, Roman commanders disrupted the landscapes through which communities understood their past. This practice was not limited to the Greek world. Ancient accounts often focus on Greek artworks because later scholars were especially interested in famous statues and paintings. Yet most Roman triumphs of the 2nd century BCE celebrated victories in regions such as Iberia, Liguria, Illyria, Dalmatia, and northern Italy. The booty from these wars looked different. Roman processions displayed captives, weapons, precious metals, models of captured cities, painted scenes of battle, and objects associated with local warrior cultures. Victories over Celtic peoples produced large quantities of swords, shields, metal vessels, and torques. In one triumph alone, more than 1,400 neck rings were reportedly paraded through Rome. Greek masterpieces were therefore exceptional rather than typical. The central point was not artistic value, but visible proof of conquest. For defeated communities, the consequences were profound. The loss of wealth weakened established elites, while the removal of sacred objects disrupted religious ceremonies. Temples could no longer function in the same way, and the families responsible for maintaining local cults often lost both their authority and their resources. Old hierarchies collapsed, but this also created opportunities for new groups. Roman allies, settlers, veterans, and cooperative local families could replace those who had been killed, exiled, or impoverished. New political systems emerged in communities whose earlier identities had been dismantled. Fregelli followed this pattern. After its destruction, some survivors were deported, and a district in Rome was later said to have been named after them. The city itself disappeared, leaving only a small settlement nearby. Its agricultural territory was divided among neighboring elites, although some members of the former ruling class may have survived. 1 year later, a new colony called Fabriteria Nova was founded south of the ruins. Its regular street plan, temples, baths, amphitheater, sanctuary, and divided farmland represented an entirely new civic order. Some settlers may have come from Fregellae, but the colony was probably dominated by loyal newcomers. An inscription records that a man named Gaius Opimius helped oversee the construction of the city's main temple. He may have been related to Lucius Opimius, the commander who destroyed Fregellae. This suggests that the victors and their associates occupied the leading offices and controlled the most prestigious building projects in the new colony. Lucius Opimius was denied a formal triumph, but he still behaved like a victorious Roman general. Above the foundations of the destroyed council house of Fregellae, he erected a victory monument, probably in the form of an arch. The placement was highly symbolic. The political center of the defeated city was erased and replaced by a monument celebrating its conqueror. Several years later, Opimius followed a similar pattern in Rome. After crushing Gaius Gracchus, he built the Temple of Concordia, transforming another act of internal violence into a public and religious statement of victory. By this point, the distinction between foreign and domestic enemies was beginning to collapse. Roman triumphal tradition had originally celebrated victories over external peoples. During the civil wars, however, generals repeatedly fought Roman citizens while presenting their victories as if they had defeated foreigners. Pompeius Strabo triumphed after capturing Asculum in the Social War. His son Pompey celebrated victories over Roman opponents in Africa and Hispania. Caesar held a triumph after defeating Pompeian forces, while Octavian transformed his war against Antony into a conflict against Cleopatra, Egypt, and the foreign East. This language concealed an uncomfortable reality. Roman commanders were using the rituals of foreign conquest to celebrate victory over fellow Romans and Italians. The same process shaped the struggle over public memory. After defeating his enemies, Sulla removed monuments connected with Marius and filled Rome with images celebrating his own achievements. He linked himself to the mythical foundations of the city and the great heroes of the Republic, while attempting to erase his opponent from public history. This symbolic destruction resembled what had happened at Fregellae. The defeated enemy was not only killed or expelled, but removed from buildings, inscriptions, monuments, and collective memory. The violence of the late Republic therefore operated on several levels at once. It destroyed bodies through massacre, starvation, and enslavement. It destroyed property through looting and confiscation. It overturned local societies by replacing old elites with settlers and supporters of the victors. It attacked religious identity by removing sacred objects and transforming sanctuaries. Finally, it reshaped public memory by erasing the monuments of the defeated and replacing them with those of the conquerors. The fall of Fregellae was an early example of this complete process. What had once been used against foreign cities was now directed against Italian allies and, eventually, against Roman citizens themselves. The brutality of Rome's civil wars is vividly illustrated by the fate of Valentia in eastern Spain. In 75 BCE, the city supported the rebel leader Quintus Sertorius against the Roman Senate. After Pompey's army captured the settlement, its defenders were subjected to a public massacre in the Forum. Archaeological excavations in modern Valencia have uncovered the physical evidence of this event. The remains of 14 victims were found near the Forum and the council house, many showing clear signs of execution, torture, and deliberate mutilation. Several young men had their legs severed, others had their hands cut off, and many were killed with carefully aimed blows after being restrained. None of the skeletons display injuries suggesting they had fought back, indicating that these were executions rather than deaths in battle. One victim suffered an especially horrific fate. His hands were tied behind his back, his legs were cut off, and he was impaled with a Roman pilum while still alive. His body was then arranged upright to resemble a tropeion, the traditional Roman victory monument normally constructed from captured weapons and armor. In this case, a human body replaced the wooden trophy. The execution was therefore more than an act of cruelty. It became a carefully staged political symbol, transforming the defeated enemy into a living monument celebrating Roman victory. Such public displays reflected broader Roman traditions. Executions, humiliation, and ritualized punishment had long been inflicted on slaves, criminals, and foreign captives. During the civil wars, however, these same methods were increasingly turned against Roman citizens and their allies. The archaeological evidence from Valentia demonstrates how military violence, political symbolism, and public spectacle became inseparable. The same mentality can be seen throughout the late Republic. The destruction of Fregellae followed methods already employed against Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia. Gaius Gracchus and his followers were declared enemies of the state through extraordinary political measures before being eliminated by force. During the social war and the civil wars that followed, Rome increasingly treated internal opponents in the same manner that it had previously treated foreign enemies. As a result, the distinction between external conquest and domestic conflict steadily disappeared. For more than a century after the Second Punic War, Rome itself had largely remained untouched, while violence was directed toward distant provinces. From the late 2nd century BCE onward, that balance collapsed. Italy became the center of war. Campania, Samnium, Latium, Picenum, northern Italy, and many other regions experienced repeated sieges, massacres, confiscations, forced migrations, and military occupation. Armies lived off the countryside, destroying farms, disrupting trade, and leaving communities impoverished for generations. This transformation did not happen suddenly. The commanders, soldiers, and politicians who fought the Social War and the later civil wars belonged to generations shaped by Rome's earlier campaigns across the Mediterranean. The methods of conquest developed in Iberia, Liguria, Greece, and North Africa were gradually transferred to Italy itself. Fregellae marked the beginning of that process. Its destruction demonstrated that Rome was now willing to employ against its own allies the same combination of massacre, ritual condemnation, confiscation, and destruction previously reserved for foreign peoples. The decades that followed merely expanded this model. By the time of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian, organized violence had become deeply embedded in Roman politics. Military victory no longer meant only defeating external enemies. It increasingly required the physical destruction, social replacement, and symbolic erasure of rival Roman communities. The history of the late Roman Republic is therefore not simply the story of political rivalry between ambitious generals. It is the story of how centuries of imperial warfare reshaped Roman society itself, until the violence once inflicted on distant peoples returned to the heart of the Republic and transformed it forever.